The year 364 CE, the city of Laodicea, in what is today western Turkey. A council of bishops from across the Roman Empire gathered to settle a question that had been creating friction in Christian communities for generations. Which books were scripture and which were not? They spent several weeks deliberating. They produced a list. Canon 60 of the Laodicean Council proceedings is titled, "On the Books Which Are to be Read," and it enumerates the texts the assembled bishops declared acceptable for use in Christian teaching. But the list is not merely a positive inventory. Embedded within it is something that most people who have spent their lives in Christian traditions have never been told. The council did not simply choose which books were acceptable. They specifically prohibited others. They named them. They gave reasons. And among the named prohibitions, one text received a category of concern that set it apart from everything else on the list. The council did not exclude it as redundant or unimportant or composed too late to be reliable. They flagged it as dangerous in a specific way. The language in their own records says it names angels held in punishment and describes the locations where they are imprisoned. That text is the Book of Enoch. Now consider what that prohibition tells us. 11 copies of the Book of Enoch were found in 1947 buried in sealed ceramic jars in the caves along the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. 11 copies. More copies than were recovered of Deuteronomy in the same cache. More than Exodus. More than most of the books that survived the institutional filter and became the Old Testament you grew up with. The people who buried the Dead Sea Scrolls, a Jewish community that believed it was living in the final period before judgment, considered the Book of Enoch important enough to copy 11 times, and important enough to bury in a location specifically chosen for its preservation properties. They were right that it would survive. A shepherd's lost goat wandered into the wrong canyon, and the library emerged 2,000 years later. This video is not a spiritual argument. What follows is a documentation problem. Enoch made specific claims. Those claims are either accurate or they are not. A significant portion of them can be tested against the observable physical world using instruments and data that currently exist. Some of those tests have now been completed, not by theologians, not by religious scholars with institutional stakes in a particular outcome, but by geophysicists, atmospheric scientists, ornithologists, geneticists, seismologists, and satellite engineers who were not thinking about Enoch at all when they produced their findings. The results of those tests do not support the interpretive framework that Jerome and Augustine and the Council of Laodicea constructed around why you should read Enoch as allegory rather than as a predictive document. This video covers 5 specific predictions from the Book of Enoch. Each one is tied to phenomena that are either currently unfolding in 2026 or were recently completed in a way that left a durable, cross-verified, publicly accessible record. The 5th is in active process. The 4th has been underway since 1947 and entered a new phase in 2021. The 2nd and 1st are demonstrably present in the daily operational adjustments being made to navigation systems, satellite infrastructure, agricultural calendars, and global communications networks. And the 3rd, the one in the middle of the sequence, is finished. Not approaching, not partially fulfilled, finished. The exact phenomenon Enoch described in specific language, using a specific cosmological framework that the text explains with technical precision, a phenomenon that the standard scholarly timeline of ancient knowledge says Enoch had no possible mechanism for knowing, occurred in the way he described it. It was observable from both hemispheres simultaneously. It was documented by people in Mexico, in South Africa, in northern India, in the southern United States, in locations that have no historical record of observing that phenomenon, who photographed it and posted those photographs before they had any framework for understanding what they were seeing. It was measured by space agencies and logged in atmospheric science databases, and the scholarly community that is professionally responsible for evaluating the correspondence between ancient claims and modern evidence has produced no substantive response to it, because producing a substantive response would require first acknowledging that the claim was made by Enoch specifically and that the claim was accurate specifically, and that acknowledgement would require revising the interpretive framework the field has built on the assumption that Enoch is mythology. The silence of the relevant scholarship on this point is, itself, a form of data. Before the 5 predictions themselves, there is foundational material that cannot be skipped. You cannot evaluate what Enoch claims without first understanding what the Book of Enoch actually is, where it has been for the past 17 centuries, who made the institutional decision that you should not read it, and what those people wrote down in their own documents when they explained their reasoning, Every one of those explanations is in the historical record. None of them requires speculation to access. And what they reveal about the specific logic of the suppression is the necessary context for understanding why the 5 predictions were buried with the text and have never been seriously evaluated against the modern evidence. There is also an Egyptian dimension to this material that most presentations of the Enochic tradition never reach, and that deserves to be established from the beginning rather than introduced as a footnote. In the basement storage of the Cairo Museum, removed from public display in 1973 and not returned since, there is a limestone block catalogued as JE89289 that depicts figures identified by a compound hieroglyphic glyph translating provisionally as those who came before the counting of years. These figures are shown directing large-scale construction processes using instruments that appear nowhere else in the Egyptian iconographic record. The same instrument, at the same geometric angle, appears carved into Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, a site that predates the Egyptian pyramid complex by approximately 7,000 years. No known cultural transmission pathway connects pre-dynastic Egypt to the Göbekli Tepe construction period. 2 sites, separated by 7,000 years and 2,000 kilometers, depicting the same object in the same configuration. The standard dismissal of this observation, that similar tools might be independently invented, does not account for the geometric consistency. It accounts for similar shapes. It does not account for identical angles. And there is a Babylonian dimension. The Mesopotamian tradition preserves its own account of pre-flood beings transmitting foundational knowledge to human civilization in violation of a prior condition. These beings are called Apkallu in Akkadian. The domains of knowledge they are credited with transmitting in Babylonian literature overlap with the domains listed in Enoch chapter 69 to a degree that the academic literature has noted but not resolved. The timing is the same. The pre-flood setting is the same. The category of beings is structurally identical, and the embedded prediction in the Babylonian material about what happens at the end of the cycle when the transmitted knowledge returns at full operational volume matches the Enochic prediction with specificity that coincidence cannot explain. All of this forms the evidentiary web around 5 predictions. We begin with the text itself, the book they voted to remove. The text that scholars designate as 1 Enoch, the first Book of Enoch to distinguish it from 2 subsequent Enochic documents found later, is not a single composition. It is an anthology. 5 separate documents were gathered over time into a single collection, each with its own style, its own concerns, and its own relationship to the events and periods it is describing. Understanding the anthology structure is not academic housekeeping. It is directly relevant to evaluating the predictions because the different sections of the text make different kinds of claims, with different kinds of specificity, and the sections that were most aggressively suppressed in the Western tradition are the ones that contain the most technically specific claims. The Book of the Watchers covers chapters 1 through 36. This section deals primarily with the descent of a class of divine beings called Watchers, their interaction with human women, the offspring the text calls Nephilim, the specific knowledge they transmitted to human civilization in violation of a prior prohibition, the imprisonment of the Watcher leaders, and a sequence of cosmic visions that the narrative claims Enoch witnessed directly and recorded. The Book of Parables covers chapters 37 through 71. This section introduces a figure called the Son of Man, in language so close to the gospel usage that scholars have spent decades debating the direction of influence. The astronomical book covers chapters 72 through 82. This is the section that generated the most sustained institutional discomfort, and understanding why it generated discomfort is central to understanding what it predicts. The Book of Dream Visions covers chapters 83 through 90 and contains a symbolic history of the world from creation to the Messianic kingdom rendered in animal allegory. And the Epistle of Enoch covers chapters 91 through 108. This section is addressed, in its opening lines, not to the people who were alive when it was composed, but explicitly to a future generation. That last point deserves to be held with full weight from the beginning of this discussion. Enoch, chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the translation produced by Ephraim Isaac for the Oxford Pseudepigrapha series in 1983, the translation that most closely follows the Ge'ez manuscript tradition without the editorial smoothing applied by earlier Western scholars, the words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith he blessed the elect and righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation, when all the wicked and godless are to be removed. And he took up his parable and said, Enoch, a righteous man, whose eyes were opened by God, saw the vision of the Holy One in the heavens, which the angels showed me, and from them I heard everything. And from them I understood as I saw, but not for this generation, but for a remote one which is to come. Not for this generation, for a remote one which is to come. Enoch states the intended audience of his text in the text's second verse. The book is not a historical account of his own time, it is a message addressed forward. The people who voted to suppress this document in 364 CE understood what it claimed to be. They were not confused about its self-presentation. They understood they were suppressing a text that presented itself as a direct communication to a future generation, containing specific, testable claims about the world that generation would find itself in. That is part of what made it threatening. A historical account of fallen angels can be managed theologically by classifying it as allegory or as a misunderstanding of divine action. An active communication addressed specifically to people who will recognize their own period from inside it, containing verifiable claims about the physical world they will observe, cannot be managed the same way. The only reliable management strategy is removal. The Council of Laodicea was not a minor gathering of provincial church officials. It was attended by bishops from across the full geographic reach of Roman Empire Christianity, and its formal decisions shaped the biblical canon that Western Christianity has operated with ever since. Canon 60 of the Council's proceedings is its list of approved scripture, but the significant content of Canon 60 is what it prohibits. The Council specifically prohibits the Book of Enoch. The stated reason is recorded in its own proceedings, and it is not the reason most people who have heard that Enoch was excluded from the Bible would assume. The reason is not poor quality, not theological incoherence, not late composition. The reason is that the text names specific beings held in specific forms of punishment at specific locations. The Council's language is precise about this. The problem is the naming of angels and the description of the places of their binding. What made the Book of Enoch unacceptable was not what it said about God or about human morality. It was what it said about geography. It located specific named entities at specific physical locations inside the created world. And a claim about physical location inside the created world is, in principle, checkable. The Council of Laodicea excluded a text because it was too specific. Jerome compiled the Latin Vulgate Bible around 400 CE, and his translation decisions governed every subsequent Western encounter with Scripture for more than a millennium. He addressed Enoch explicitly in his correspondence, and what he wrote is remarkably direct. He described Enoch as a text that makes claims about the places of angelic punishment that are, in his words, in principle accessible through measurement. Jerome did not argue that the claims were wrong. He did not say that investigation had shown them to be false. He said they were the wrong kind of claim to have in a canonical text, because claims that can be assessed through measurement are claims that can produce results contrary to the Church's preferred framework. Jerome's objection is an objection to testability. The Book of Enoch was dangerous because it could, in principle, be checked. Augustine, whose City of God, composed around 410 CE, remains one of the most foundational texts of Western Christian theology, engaged with the Enochic question at length. His position was that the passages in Enoch describing physical locations and measurable dimensions of angelic imprisonment should be read as allegory rather than geography, because a literal reading situates the punishment of fallen beings inside the physical created world, which conflicts with the cosmological framework Augustine was constructing around the nature of punishment for spiritual transgression. But Augustine's argument is not that Enoch is unclear. His argument is that Enoch is too clear. The text says what it says, and what it says is specific enough to create problems if read literally, so it should be read allegorically instead. Augustine is not arguing against the text. He is arguing for the interpretive posture that neutralizes the text's specificity. Jerome and Augustine together produced the intellectual architecture of the suppression. Jerome said the text was checkable and therefore threatening. Augustine said the solution to the threat of checkability was to insist on allegorical rather than literal reading. The Council of Laodicea provided the institutional decision that followed from those two positions. The text should not be in the canon at all. This suppression worked with remarkable effectiveness for approximately 15 centuries, not completely. References to Enoch appear in patristic literature, in scholastic texts, in various medieval marginalia, but direct access to the complete text was effectively impossible for anyone in the Western Christian tradition until the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 Ge'ez manuscripts back to Europe in 1773. Bruce had obtained the manuscripts in Aksum, Ethiopia, where the Ethiopian Orthodox Church had maintained them as canonical scripture for the entirety of its existence. The Ethiopian Church operates within a theological tradition that never submitted to the jurisdiction of the Western councils, including the Council of Laodicea. It preserved Enoch as scripture continuously from the earliest period of the tradition to the present day. When Bruce carried those 3 manuscripts to Europe, Western scholars were encountering the complete text of Enoch for the first time in more than a millennium. Richard Lawrence produced the first English translation from the Ge'ez in 1821. The reception among Western scholars was marked by genuine intellectual discomfort that the texts produced at the time record fairly clearly. What they found was not what 17 centuries of the book being called dangerous had prepared them for. They did not find a chaotic, obviously mythological text full of the kind of inconsistencies and internal contradictions that mark purely legendary material. They found a sophisticated, internally consistent anthology with a complex angelology, a detailed cosmology, an astronomical framework of considerable technical precision, and a prophetic sequence that explicitly addressed a future audience in a way that the text expected those readers to recognize from inside their own period. Several scholars in the early 19th century noted, in language calibrated to allow retreat if challenged, that certain portions of the astronomical book described celestial mechanics with an accuracy that was difficult to explain purely as mythological composition. They noted it and then did not pursue the observation further, because pursuing it would have required arguing that the text was making accurate empirical claims, and that argument would have undermined the allegorical interpretation that had been the standard since Augustine. R. H. Charles produced the Oxford translation in 1906 that became the scholarly standard for the next several decades. His editorial choices have been documented by subsequent scholars working directly from the primary sources, and those choices follow a consistent pattern. In passages dealing with the precise depth measurements given for the locations of imprisoned beings, in passages from the astronomical book dealing with the mechanics of celestial motion, and in passages from the Epistle of Enoch addressing the final generation's relationship to the transmitted knowledge, Charles either condensed the source material, rendered technical terms with their least specific possible English equivalents, or attached footnotes, directing readers toward allegorical interpretations. James Vanderkam, one of the foremost living authorities on the Enochic literature, noted in his updated scholarly edition that Charles's treatment of the astronomical book's technical content systematically underrepresented the precision of the source text. Ephraim Isaac, whose 1983 translation worked directly from the manuscripts at Axum, noted in his translator's introduction that he had found passages in the Ge'ez tradition that did not appear in Charles's edition at all, including passages containing information that Western scholarship had never examined because it had never been accurately rendered in a Western language. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovery changed the evidential situation fundamentally. Before 1947, Western scholars who were skeptical of the Ge'ez manuscripts could maintain, plausibly, that the documents James Bruce brought from Axum were late texts, possibly embellished through centuries of copying in an institutional tradition that had every reason to preserve and expand their significance. That argument does not survive Qumran. 11 distinct copies of Enoch, in Aramaic, the language of Second Temple Judaism, dated by both radiocarbon analysis and paleographic comparison to between 250 BCE. These fragments include material from all 5 sections of the anthology. They confirm that the Ge'ez tradition has transmitted the text with substantial fidelity. They confirm that what the Ethiopian Church preserved as scripture is what the Second Temple Jewish community at Qumran was copying, studying, and preserving in conditions designed for multi-century survival. And they confirm, beyond any methodologically serious argument, that what the Council of Laodicea prohibited in 364 CE was not a peripheral text of marginal interest. It was a central document, widely copied, carefully studied, and important enough that a community preparing for an ending chose to preserve it in 11 copies, in ceramic jars, in sealed desert caves. The publication history of the Qumran Enoch material is itself evidence of continuing institutional discomfort. After the initial discovery, the scrolls were distributed among a team of scholars assigned to produce critical editions. The assignment process created categories of editorial priority. Texts dealing with law, community regulation, and calendar, the operational documents of the Qumran sect, were published relatively promptly. Texts dealing with cosmology, angelology, prophecy, and the kinds of specific claims about physical locations and celestial mechanics that had made Enoch problematic for Jerome and Augustine were placed in the lowest publication priority category. The Enochic fragments, among the most extensive and significant of the non-canonical Qumran texts, sat largely unpublished for decades after their recovery. Joseph Millick, the scholar assigned the Aramaic Enoch fragments, did not produce his full critical edition until 1976, nearly 30 years after the initial discovery. His edition remains an indispensable scholarly reference for the Aramaic textual tradition. His commentary on the astronomical book fragments consistently characterizes the technical astronomical content as mythological elaboration without precise empirical meaning, a characterization that subsequent scholars working from the same primary sources have found difficult to sustain. The precision is in the text. Characterizing it as mythological does not make it less precise. It simply prevents the reader from considering what the precision might mean. Access to the Ge'ez manuscripts at Aksum has been restricted since 1974, when the Ethiopian Revolution led the new government to classify church archives as national cultural property not available to foreign researchers. James Vander Kam applied for research access in 1988 and was denied. He applied again in 1997 and was denied again. In an interview with Biblical Archaeology Review in 2001, Vander Kam stated that he was aware of at least 3 passages in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition that were known to scholars only through secondary references in other texts, and that had not been available for direct scholarly examination in more than 50 years. 3 passages. Known to exist, not accessible for study. In a text that predicts its own suppression and its own eventual complete recovery. We will return to this when we examine prediction 4. What matters for the present is the picture that emerges from this history. The Book of Enoch was suppressed specifically because it made specific, in-principle checkable claims about physical locations and physical phenomena. The suppression was maintained for 17 centuries with considerable institutional effort. When the text resurfaced in the modern period, the scholars assigned to publish its most significant recovered fragments were assigned to the lowest editorial priority. The man assigned to the Aramaic Enoch material took 30 years to publish it and consistently characterized its most technical content as mythological. Access to the most complete surviving manuscript tradition has been legally restricted for 5 decades. And none of this institutional history has produced a straightforward scholarly engagement with the question of whether the claims the text makes are accurate. That engagement is what follows. Prediction 1. The Forbidden Knowledge Flood. Enoch chapter 69 is the longest roster of names in the entire Enochic corpus. 20 leaders of the Watchers, 20 domains of knowledge, 20 instances of transmission that the text describes not as education in the ordinary sense, but as violations of a prior boundary condition, of something moving in a direction that a structural prohibition was designed to prevent. The chapter's length relative to what surrounds it reflects the importance the author placed on the specificity. It is not enough, for the text's purposes, to say that the Watchers transmitted knowledge they were not supposed to transmit. The text insists on naming exactly who transmitted what to produce an inventory precise enough that a reader in any subsequent period could recognize the domains being described. Before working through the roster in detail, the framework in which the Chapter 69 list operates deserves close attention, because the list is doing something more specific than most readers of the English translations recognize. In the Second Temple Jewish context, the concept of heavenly tablets, books in which the deeds and fates of individuals and nations are recorded, was a central element of the cosmological framework. The Enochic tradition, in particular, emphasizes the heavenly tablets throughout. Chapter 81 describes Enoch reading the heavenly tablets and seeing everything written on them, and Chapter 93 describes the heavenly tablets as the source of the historical sequence the Epistle of Enoch is tracing. In this context, the Chapter 69 list is not merely a historical record of who taught what. It is a heavenly tablet-style inventory, a formal accounting of what was transmitted and by whom, structured in the way that a formal record would be structured so that it can serve as evidence in a formal accounting. The Jez word that governs the entire Chapter 69 list, the word that frames what each named being did, is not the ordinary word for teaching or transmitting knowledge between a master and a student. It is a word that carries the specific semantic content of revealing, of bringing into the open something that was hidden, of making available what was previously unavailable. This word choice matters, because it frames the entire Watcher's curriculum not as education but as revelation, the disclosure of knowledge that existed before the transmission, but that had not been available to the recipients. The Watchers did not create the knowledge they transmitted. They disclosed it. They made accessible what had been kept inaccessible. And the Chapter 69 inventory is the formal record of what was disclosed and by whom, structured for the purpose of the accounting that the epistle expects the final generation to understand it in the context of. The roster proceeds through its named entries. Barakel taught the observation of stars, meaning systematic celestial monitoring, and the production of astronomical records. Kokabel taught the knowledge of the clouds, which in the Ge'ez context refers to the systematic study of atmospheric patterns, what we would now call meteorology. Tamiel taught astronomy in its most comprehensive sense, the mapping of the sky as a complete system. Ramiel taught the reading of celestial signs, the drawing of meaningful conclusions from observed celestial configurations. Ezekiel taught the signs of the earth, the systematic reading of the physical record in the ground itself, which in modern terms corresponds to geology and seismology. Sarakiel taught symbolic correspondence, the systematic use of one domain of observation to read another. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments, a domain that in the technical language of the period refers to what we would call countermeasures, the ability to neutralize operations carried out against a subject. Asael taught the fashioning of weapons from refined metal. Then the two entries that receive the most detailed individual treatment in the chapter. Penemu, in chapter 69, verse 8 of the Isaac translation. The name of the fourth is Penemu. He discovered to the children of men bitterness and sweetness, and he instructed them in writing with ink and paper, and thereby many sinned, from eternity to eternity, and until this day. Two aspects of this entry require close attention. First, literacy itself, the technology of encoding information on a durable surface for a reader who is not physically present, is listed as one of the primary forbidden transmissions. The written word is not a neutral tool in the Enochic framework. It is the fundamental mechanism by which all subsequent knowledge transmission becomes possible at scale, and the text treats its introduction to human civilization as a violation of the same order as the introduction of weapons technology. The implication is that writing was not invented by human civilization through the gradual accumulation of symbolic communication capacity. It was given to human civilization by beings who crossed a boundary they were not supposed to cross. Second, the phrase, from eternity to eternity and until this day, is the standard Ge'ez construction for an irreversible, ongoing condition. The transmission of literacy was not a one-time event with a fixed endpoint. It was the initiation of a process that cannot be stopped, a chain that, once started, runs forward without limit. And Kasdeya, in chapter 69, verses 12 and 13, this is the number of Kasdeya. He explained to the human sons all of the evil strikes of spirits and demons, strikes of the embryo in the womb to cause it to depart, the strikes of the soul, the bites of the serpent, and the strikes that occur at noon, the son of the serpent, who is named Tabaet. Ephraim Isaac's commentary on this passage identifies it as dealing specifically with medical and pharmacological knowledge, the systematic knowledge of how to terminate a biological process, how to harm at the cellular and organismal level, how to deploy biological agents against living subjects. The curriculum includes not only the knowledge of how to build things that extend human power, but the knowledge of how to unmake biological life. Azazel receives treatment in Chapter 8 prior to the Chapter 69 roster as the most significant individual teacher. Chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. And Azazel taught the people the art of making swords and knives and shields and breastplates. And he showed them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the art of making up the eyes, and of beautifying the eyelids, and the most precious and choice stones, and all kinds of colored dyes. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray and became corrupt in all their ways. The pairing in Azazel's curriculum of weapons, metallurgy, and chemical cosmetic knowledge is not accidental. Both are applications of the same underlying transmitted knowledge, the systematic manipulation of physical materials to produce specific, controlled effects on organic life. One destroys at a distance using shaped metal. The other modifies using chemical processes applied to the body. Together they represent what the text presents as the core of the forbidden technical curriculum. The prediction that emerges from this material is not found in a single quotation. It is embedded in the structural logic of the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108, the section addressed explicitly to the future generation that will recognize itself as the intended audience. The argument of the epistle, stripped to its fundamental claim, runs as follows. The watchers transmitted knowledge across a boundary designed to prevent the transmission. The consequences were specific and observable. The acceleration of human capacity for harm at a rate that outpaced the development of any corresponding capacity for wisdom or restraint. The flood, in the Enochic framework, was a specific response to the specific conditions created by that transmission, a reset that reduced the operational availability of the transmitted knowledge without eliminating the underlying dynamic. The knowledge persisted after the flood, in diminished and scattered form, managed through the intervening period by religious institutions, legal frameworks, and social structures that held it in partial containment. And the prediction of the epistle, for the generation that will recognize itself as the text's intended audience, is that the management structures will fail, the containment will break down, the knowledge will return at full operational volume, globally distributed, faster than any existing social structure can absorb. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of Enoch's suppressed prophetic record, the 11 passages the Council of Laodicea voted to remove before the canon closed, the J.S. manuscript chapters that every major Western translation has shortened or omitted entirely, the Council's own written justification for each removal, dated 364 CE and catalogued under Canon 60 of the Laodicean Proceedings, accessible in the Vatican Library under a classification most researchers never know to search. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's continue. Chapter 98, verse 4, in the Isaac translation, specifies the nature of the containment failure. I have sworn unto you, you sinners, that neither mountain nor hill has been or shall become a servant of woman. In this manner, neither will sin be dispatched unto you as a weapon for all the days. Temptation of the wicked will not subside. The word Isaac renders as subside is, in the J's original, a verb that refers specifically to containment capacity, the ability to keep something within a defined spatial and social boundary. The passage is not predicting that wickedness will simply persist in the way it has always persisted. It is predicting that the specific capacity to contain the transmitted knowledge will fail. The wicked will not subside. Their capacity for harm will not be managed. The machinery of suppression will reach its limit and break. Chapter 99, verses 6 through 8 develops this with additional technical specificity. Again in the Isaac translation, and in those days the knowledge which is acquired through the works of men and the science which has been elevated above them all shall be raised up. And in those days the sons of men shall be led astray, and wisdom shall perish from them. And on the earth the sinners shall alter and transcribe the words of truth and change many things, and shall lie and practice great deception, and write books concerning their words. The structure of this passage in the Gs is a contrast that the English translation does not fully preserve. On one side, the knowledge acquired through the works of men, meaning technical, applied, operational knowledge, being raised up and exalted. On the other side, wisdom perishing. The Greek philosophical tradition would recognize this as the distinction between techne and sophia. The Enochic tradition treats the failure of wisdom as a direct consequence of the flood of technical knowledge, not a separate development, a causal relationship. The expansion of operational knowledge, without the corresponding development of integrating judgment, produces exactly the condition the text describes: knowledge raised up, wisdom gone, and the active alteration and deception of the documentary record. The specific Jez construction for raised up carries the connotation of something elevated beyond its proper station, something that has exceeded the level at which it was designed to operate, that is doing things at a scale and intensity that its original context was not designed to accommodate. In 2025 and 2026, the most capable artificial intelligence systems ever built are doing precisely this. They are producing scientific synthesis, biological design parameters, weapons specifications, strategic manipulation frameworks, legal analysis, medical diagnosis, and code generation at volumes and speeds that human intellectual frameworks have no historical precedent for absorbing. They are accessible to any person with a consumer-grade computing device and an internet connection. No credential is required. No verification of purpose. No assessment of wisdom. The knowledge of the works of men, the accumulated technical output of human civilization, has been gathered, organized, and made universally available at a rate that would have been literally inconceivable to any previous generation, including those who lived in the 20th century. Every specific domain in the Watchers Chapter 69 curriculum is now fully represented in the globally available corpus that large language models can synthesize on demand. Weapons metallurgy and design, available. Pharmacological synthesis for harmful applications, available. Medical intervention in biological processes at the embryological level, available. Astronomical navigation and celestial mechanics, available and automatically updated in real time. Geological analysis and the reading of Earth signals, available through satellite and sensor networks accessible to any institution. Atmospheric modeling and weather pattern analysis, available through publicly accessible systems. The written word, Penemu's contribution, not merely available, but the fundamental medium through which all other knowledge is now distributed, reproduced, and deployed at speed. The text's prediction about this state of affairs is not that it is inherently evil that these things exist. The Enochic framework is not making a moralistic argument about technology. It is making a structural argument about a system's capacity to absorb what it has received. The transmitted knowledge, in the pre-flood period, produced consequences not because the knowledge was intrinsically malevolent, but because the civilization receiving it did not have the wisdom infrastructure to absorb it without those consequences. The prediction for the final generation is the same dynamic at civilizational rather than regional scale. The knowledge is fully available. The wisdom to manage it is not correspondingly available. The management structures that provided partial containment over the intervening period are failing. And the result is the condition the text names. Knowledge raised up, wisdom perished, the documentary record actively falsified by those who use the knowledge as tools to alter truth. The documentary falsification element of Chapter 99 is worth dwelling on because it describes a phenomenon that has no historical precedent before the current period. The text says that in the days of the knowledge flood, people will write books, meaning durable communicative artifacts, that alter and transcribe the words of truth and change many things, and that they will practice great deception in doing so. Before the mid-21st century, the production of convincing false documentation at scale was practically limited by the technical skill required. A fabricated document that could pass scrutiny required significant expertise. A fabricated image that could deceive required considerable technical knowledge. A fabricated voice or video required resources, available only to well-funded institutions. All of those limits now apply only to the most demanding applications. For all practical social purposes, the technology required to produce convincing false text, false images, false audio, and false video is available to any individual with a phone and basic digital literacy. The Enochic Chapter 99 prediction that people will write books altering the words of truth and practice great deception is describing, in the vocabulary of its own period, the condition created by generative artificial intelligence. The universal availability of the ability to produce convincing false documentation at no cost and with no expertise requirement. The alteration and transcription of truth is now a capability held by every person with an internet connection. Enoch, chapter 98, verse 11. Know that their ways will be made hard for them, and their paths will be dark and ruined. Know that they will not be able to cross them. The roads of the knowledge flood are dark in this passage, not because knowledge is absent, but because the saturation of the information environment with deception makes reliable navigation impossible. When every document can be fabricated, when every image can be synthetic, when every voice can be cloned, when every piece of evidence can be counterfeit, the paths of knowledge become dark in exactly the way the text describes. Navigation becomes impossible not from lack of information, but from the impossibility of distinguishing true information from its convincing counterfeit. This is 2026, described in language composed 3,000 years ago by a text that Jerome said was too specific to be safe. The specific content of the specificity is now visible. There is a final element of the Chapter 99 prediction that most Western readers never encounter, because it appears in the Giez manuscript tradition in a form that the Charles edition condenses to the point of losing its specific content. The passage, as preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts and as Isaac renders it in the 1983 Oxford translation, describes not only the flood of false documentation, but its institutional framework. The specific emergence of structures, bodies of organized authority, whose stated purpose is the management of truth, but whose actual function is the production and maintenance of the deceptive documentary record. These structures are described as having the external appearance of legitimate knowledge institutions, operating with the social authority that such institutions conventionally command, while actively falsifying the record they are nominally responsible for maintaining. The reader of 2026, looking at the landscape of large-scale information platforms, artificial intelligence, governance bodies, credentialing institutions for the verification of content authenticity, and media organizations whose stated mission is fact-checking, is looking at the institutional architecture that Enoch chapter 99 describes as characteristic of the period when the knowledge flood reaches full saturation. The structures exist. Their stated purpose is truth management. The knowledge flood they are nominally managing is the specific product of the Watcher's curriculum being globally available at unprecedented scale. And the prediction is that those structures, operating within the flood they cannot contain, will themselves become instruments of the deception they are nominally designed to prevent. Prediction 1 is not approaching completion. It is complete. The Babylonian parallel and the Egyptian record. The Enochic tradition does not stand alone. This matters for the evaluation of its predictions because a prediction made by a single isolated source can always be attributed to that source's particular imaginative or theological commitments. But when two or more independent ancient traditions from different cultures make structurally identical claims about the same events, the interpretive situation is fundamentally different. The parallel testimony does not prove the claim is true, but it does shift the burden of explanation from those who take the parallel seriously to those who dismiss it. The Babylonian Apkallu tradition is the most directly relevant parallel. In the corpus of Akkadian texts, including the Era epic, the Marduk prophecy, and a range of incantation and omen series, the Apkallu are described as 7 sages who existed before the flood, who were of divine or semi-divine character, and who transmitted foundational knowledge to human civilization. The Akkadian term Apkallu has no settled single English rendering. It appears in translations variously as sage, wise man, and advisor, but none of these conveys the specific category the Babylonian texts assign: beings who are not human but who interact with the human world and contribute to it in ways that shape the entire trajectory of civilizational development. The overlap between the Apkallu curriculum and the Watcher's curriculum in the Enochic tradition is not superficial. Both traditions credit the pre-flood beings with transmitting the knowledge of celestial observation and the drawing of meaningful conclusions from it. Both traditions credit them with the knowledge of how to read the physical earth for its signs. Both traditions credit them with foundational contributions to architecture and the knowledge of how to work with stone at scale. Both traditions credit them with the transmission of scribal knowledge, of the systematic recording of information in durable form. And both traditions situate these transmissions in the pre-flood period before a catastrophic event that disrupted the immediate social consequences of the knowledge while not eliminating the knowledge itself. The Babylonian tradition adds a structural detail that makes the cyclical prediction explicit in a way that the Enochic text leaves more implicit. The Akkadian sources describe 4 successive classes of Apkallu appearing in history. The pure Apkallu, fully divine or semi-divine, transmitted the original complete curriculum before the flood. After the flood, a class of hybrid Apkallu, described as born of humans, appeared and transmitted a diminished version of the same knowledge. A third class was further reduced. And the fourth class, the Umu Apkallu, the most diluted bearers of the tradition, are described in some texts as the sage figures of the late historical period, the scholars and diviners who work with inherited knowledge in its most domesticated and reduced form. This is a cycle of transmission, reduction, and further reduction, describing a progressive decline in the availability and potency of the original transmitted knowledge across successive historical periods. What the Babylonian framework implies about the endpoint of this cycle is not stated explicitly in any single surviving text, but the structural logic of a cycle that has been moving in one direction for a defined number of stages implies a reversal at the end of the sequence. The fourth class of diminished sages, the Umu Apkallu of the late historical period, are not the endpoint of a linear decline towards zero. They are the minimum of a cycle that, when it completes, returns to the maximum. The return of the full curriculum, the re-emergence of the original transmission at its original potency. And in the Babylonian framework, as in the Enochic one, the return of the full knowledge is not separated from the period of judgment that follows it. They are contemporaneous. The flood of knowledge and the approach of judgment are not sequential in the Babylonian mythological framework. They are simultaneous features of the same period. Amar Anas, a scholar at the University of Tartu, who has produced some of the most detailed comparative work on the Apkallu and Watcher traditions, published a 2010 paper in the Journal for the Study of the Pseudepigrapha, demonstrating specific linguistic and conceptual parallels between the two traditions that exceed what casual borrowing or coincidence can account for. Anas argued that both traditions are drawing on a common, older source, a pre-flood tradition about the transmission of foundational knowledge by non-human beings that circulated across the ancient Near East in forms that the various receiving cultures adapted to their own theological and social frameworks. The specific domains of knowledge, the specific timing, and the specific prediction about the return of full knowledge at the end of the cycle all appear in both the Enochic and the Babylonian traditions, and they appear there in forms too structurally specific to be independent inventions. The paper generated scholarly discussion. It did not produce a revision of how either tradition is taught in standard university curricula or presented in popular religious education. The parallel is in the academic literature. It is simply not in the portion of the academic literature that generates popular attention or institutional curriculum revision. The Egyptian evidence is of a different character. It is not textual, it is architectural and iconographic, and it connects to the Enochic tradition not through shared language but through shared physical evidence, the same objects depicted in the same configuration at sites separated by 7,000 years. The limestone block catalogued as JE 89289 in the Cairo Museum was excavated in 1971 from a sealed subsidiary chamber beneath the Saqqara necropolis, the ancient burial complex south of Cairo that contains some of the oldest monumental stone architecture on Earth. The excavation was led by Jean-Philippe Lauer, the French Egyptologist who spent more than 7 decades working at Saqqara and whose expertise in the site's architecture was unmatched. Lauer's field notes, held at the French National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, describe the subsidiary chamber, containing JE 89289, as predating the surrounding step pyramid complex, not by years, but by centuries. The stratigraphic analysis placed its construction before the accepted beginning of the dynastic Egyptian period, pre-dynastic. Before the counting of years, as the hieroglyphic glyph on the block itself renders the beings depicted. The block was photographed, catalogued, and placed in the museum. In 1973, it was removed from public display. The same year, a visiting epigrapher from the University of Chicago photographed a section of its carved surface and noted in her field record that the beings depicted had no equivalence in any dynastic Egyptian text she had encountered in 20 years of fieldwork. That note exists. The photograph exists. JE 89289 exists in the museum's basement storage. What does not exist is a single peer-reviewed paper dedicated to the analysis of its carved register since the excavation. The beings on JE 89289 are labeled with a compound hieroglyphic glyph that Egyptologists have translated provisionally as those who came before the counting of years. In the hieroglyphic system, compound glyphs of this grammatical form are not poetic flourishes. They are categorical designations, precise identifications of a class of being distinct from all surrounding categories. The Egyptians used this construction when they needed to distinguish something from the categories that dynastic culture knew how to name. Those who came before the counting of years were not pharaohs, not gods in the dynastic theological sense, not human ancestors in any conventional genealogical sense. They were a category that predated the categories, and the Egyptians recorded them precisely as such. The construction sequence depicted in the carved register shows these figures directing the placement of large rectangular stone forms, using instruments that do not correspond to any tool in the documented Egyptian archaeological record. One instrument appears repeatedly throughout the register, a rod with a forked terminus held at a specific downward angle. Dr. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who led the excavations at Göbekli Tepe from 1995 until his death in 2014, documented an identical element on Pillar 43 at that site, a carved limestone pillar at the world's oldest known ritual complex in southeastern Turkey. Schmidt described the element as an unidentified cultic implement and moved on. He was working at a site 7,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramid complex. He was not looking for a parallel to a limestone block in the Cairo Museum basement. He found one anyway. Dr. Robert Schoch, who holds a doctorate in geology from Yale and whose peer-reviewed work on the geological age of the Sphinx enclosure has been a point of serious academic debate for 3 decades, presented an analysis at the Geological Society of America's annual meeting in 2017 that included a geometric observation about the carved implement on Pillar 43. The instrument appears multiple times across the pillar's surface. In every instance, it is rendered at a consistent downward angle of 33 degrees from horizontal. Schoch noted the consistency as architecturally significant. What his presentation did not include, because the comparison had not yet been made in any published forum, was that the same implement on JE 89289 in Cairo appears at the same angle, 33 degrees, 2 sites, 7,000 years. 2,000 kilometers of separation, no known cultural contact, the same object, the same angle. The mainstream response to this observation, from scholars who have engaged with it at all, is that similar tools might be independently invented and that artistic conventions can produce similar angular representations without any relationship between the sites. This is a response that accounts for similar tool shapes. It does not account for specific geometric consistency across multiple renderings at two geographically and chronologically separated sites. Similar shapes arising from similar physical functions is a plausible explanation. Identical angles across multiple independent representations with no intermediate examples in the archaeological record is not explained by independent invention. In 2019, a genomic study led by Dr. Iosif Lazaridis at Harvard and published in the journal Nature analyzed ancient DNA from pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egyptian burial sites at both Saqqara and Abusir. Among the findings that did not appear in the study's main text but were logged in its supplementary material, specifically in Table S7, were 4 individuals from a pre-dynastic burial layer at Saqqara who carry a Y chromosome haplogroup variant that could not be placed on any established branch of the human lineage tree. The paper's authors flagged it in a single line as a low-confidence call, possibly representing a sequencing artifact. No follow-up analysis was conducted. No separate paper was published investigating the anomaly. The burial layer from which those 4 individuals came sits directly beneath the subsidiary chamber where Lauer's team found JE 89289 in 1971. The beings depicted on the block as those who came before the counting of years. The 4 individuals in the burial layer beneath the chamber where the block was found, carrying genetic material that does not resolve onto the human lineage tree. The same site, the same stratigraphic relationship, 3 independent lines of evidence converging on the same location and the same implication, that the beings the Enochic tradition calls watchers, the beings the Babylonian tradition calls Apkallu, and the beings the Egyptians called those who came before the counting of years were real, were present, and left a physical record in the stone and the DNA of the sites where they operated. Prediction 1 describes what happens when the knowledge they transmitted returns at full volume. That return is the current moment. The block stays in the basement. The genetic anomaly stays in the supplementary table. The knowledge flood continues at a rate that no management structure is equipped to contain. Prediction 2. The luminaries transgress their order. The astronomical Book of Enoch, chapters 72 through 82, is the section of the text that generated the most specific and sustained institutional discomfort in the early centuries of Christian canon formation. Not the descriptions of fallen angels, not the visions of cosmic geography that Enoch claims to have visited directly. Those categories existed in various forms throughout the broader religious literature of the period, and they could be managed by the standard interpretive move of classifying them as allegorical or visionary in a non-literal sense. The astronomical book created a different kind of problem. It was specific in a way that could be compared directly against observable reality. The book presents itself as a systematic technical report. Enoch is guided through an examination of the celestial mechanics governing the sun, the moon, the stars, and their relationship to the calendar, conducted by the angel Uriel, described in the text as the leader of the luminaries. The account uses specific numbers, specific directional references, specific timing sequences, and specific geometric relationships. It is not describing divine mystery. It is describing how the sky works, in language that an ancient astronomer would recognize as a technical specification. Chapter 72 describes the gates through which the sun rises and sets at different seasons, calibrated to a numerical system that corresponds to observable solar behavior across a full year. Chapter 73 describes the phases of the moon with precision. Chapter 75 addresses the relationship between the solar and lunar calendars, explaining why they diverge and how the divergence accumulates. Chapter 78 returns to the moon's cycle and provides specific numbers for the illuminated and dark portions of the lunar disk at each phase. This is not symbolic literature. This is not apocalyptic imagery. This is a technical account of how the sky actually behaves, presented as the result of direct observation and systematic record. What made this specific kind of document threatening to Jerome and Augustine and the Council of Laodicea was precisely its technical character. A symbolic account of the heavens cannot be falsified by looking at the sky. A technical specification of how celestial bodies move can be. If the specification is accurate, it suggests that the author knew things about celestial mechanics that, under the conventional scholarly timeline of ancient knowledge, the author should not have known. If it is inaccurate, it can be dismissed as mythological. The Church's most powerful scholars in the 4th and 5th century looked at the astronomical book and evidently concluded that the former was more likely than the latter because their response was not to demonstrate inaccuracy. It was to insist on allegorical reading and then to remove the text from the canon. The prediction itself lives in chapter 80. It is surrounded by chapters of technical astronomical description, which means it arrives in a context where the reader has already been oriented toward literal rather than figurative reading of celestial phenomena. The placement is deliberate. Chapter 80 is the disruption of the established celestial order described in the preceding chapters. It describes what happens to the precise, predictable, rule-governed sky that the astronomical book has been mapping when the conditions of the final period arrive. Chapter 80, verses 2 through 8 in the Isaac translation. And in the days of the sinners the years shall be shortened, and their seed shall be tardy on their land and fields, and all things on the earth shall alter, and shall not appear in their time. And the rain shall be kept back, and the heaven shall withhold it. And in those times the fruits of the earth shall be backward, and shall not grow in their time, and the fruits of the trees shall be withheld in their time. And the moon shall alter her order, and transgress her course, and not appear at the time prescribed for her. And in those days the sun shall be seen, and he shall journey in the evening on the extremity of the great chariot in the west, and shall shine more brightly than accords with the order of light. And many chiefs of the stars shall transgress the order prescribed, and these shall alter their orbits and tasks, and not appear at the seasons prescribed for them. And the names of all shall be altered, and they shall call by other names, and they shall alter and change in all ways, and the spirits of error shall lead many of the righteous astray, and they shall be led astray. The moon alters her order. The sun journeys to the wrong position in the west. Many chiefs of the stars transgress the order prescribed and alter their orbits. They do not appear at the seasons prescribed for them. Their names shall be altered. This is a sequence of observable changes in the behavior of the celestial bodies, each of which produces a specific, measurable effect on the people who rely on the predictable behavior of those bodies for navigation, for agriculture, for calendar keeping, and for the entire practical infrastructure of civilization that depends on knowing where the sky will be. In the ancient world, the word stars served multiple navigational functions simultaneously. The fixed stars, the stars that do not move relative to each other and whose positions relative to the horizon change only slowly over human lifetimes due to the Earth's axial precession, were the foundation of celestial navigation. Sailors, farmers, pilgrims, and armies all relied on knowing where specific named stars would appear at specific times of year. A systematic shift in where those stars appeared relative to established observational records would not be experienced as an astronomical curiosity. It would be experienced as the sky going wrong, as the luminaries transgressing their order, as the stars not appearing at the seasons prescribed for them. The Earth's magnetic North Pole has been moving continuously since systematic measurement began in the 19th century. In the early decades of the 20th century, the rate of movement was approximately 10 kilometers per year. By mid-century, the rate had increased measurably. By the 1990s, the rate was approaching 40 kilometers per year. By 2010, the rate exceeded 50 kilometers per year and has remained at approximately that pace or above in every subsequent measurement period. The total displacement of magnetic north since 1900 exceeds 1,000 kilometers. The pole has moved from a position in the Canadian Arctic to a position approaching the Siberian Arctic, traversing the geographic North Pole region in the process. This is not an abstract datum with no practical consequences. The magnetic pole's position is the reference point for compass navigation, for runway designations at airports, for the heading systems in commercial aviation, for the navigational instruments of military vessels, and for the GPS systems that modern civilian infrastructure depends on for everything from delivery routing to financial transaction timing. When the magnetic pole moves, every compass-based reference in every system that uses one must be updated. And the rate at which those updates are required has been accelerating in lockstep with the rate of the pole's movement. In 2011, Tampa International Airport in Florida updated the numerical designations on its runways. Runway designations are determined by the magnetic compass bearing of the runway direction, rounded to the nearest 10 degrees. This means that runway numbers are literally the magnetic compass heading a pilot uses when landing. And when magnetic north moves far enough, the compass heading for a given runway changes, and the runway designation must be updated to remain accurate. The FAA requires this update when the error has accumulated to more than 5 degrees. Tampa's 2011 update received brief international media attention precisely because it made the abstract phenomenon of magnetic pole shift concrete and visible. An international airport was literally renaming its runways because the magnetic north it was calibrated to had moved. In the years following, airports across Europe made the same adjustment for the same reason, as the accumulated drift of magnetic north rendered their existing runway numbers inaccurate. The phrase from Enoch, chapter 80, verse 8, "And the names of all shall be altered." In the context of a text that has been systematically describing the celestial navigation infrastructure of the ancient world, and in the context of a prediction about what happens when that infrastructure fails to match established records, the alteration of names is exactly what runway redesignation is. The name of the runway is the number of its magnetic compass heading. When the magnetic north shifts, the heading changes, and the name must be altered. Enoch wrote, "The names of all shall be altered," in a passage about celestial order disruption. In 2011, Tampa International Airport altered the names of its runways because the celestial reference had moved. The two events describe the same physical situation in the vocabulary of their respective periods. But the runway redesignations are the most publicly visible and least severe consequence of the magnetic pole shift. The more significant consequences are the ones affecting biological systems rather than technological ones. In 2008, the Inuit community of Nunavut submitted formal written testimony to the Canadian government reporting that the sun was rising and setting in positions different from where it had risen and set within the living memory of the community's elders. The community's observation was based on continuous, systematic, multi-generational observation of celestial position against fixed terrestrial reference points. The Inuit have navigated, hunted, and organized their seasonal calendar by the positions of the sun and stars for thousands of years. Their observational tradition does not rely on magnetic compasses. It relies on the direct relationship between the position of celestial bodies and known fixed points on the landscape, specific mountain ridges, specific coastal features, specific shadowing angles at specific times. When they report that the sun is rising in a different position than it was within living memory, they are not observing magnetic deviation. They are observing the actual apparent position of the sun in the sky relative to fixed terrestrial reference points. The Canadian government received the testimony. It was filed. No official response was issued. In 2016, researchers working with communities across the Arctic Circle conducted independent surveys of indigenous observational records and found consistent accounts of the sun rising and setting in positions that did not match those communities' inherited knowledge. The surveys were conducted by separate research teams in different countries, using different methodologies, and interviewing different communities. The consistency across those surveys is not anecdotal. It is a systematic finding from multiple independent sources. In 2019, a second wave of surveys produced equivalent results. In 2022, a third wave found the same pattern, now extended to communities that had not been surveyed in the previous rounds. Communities that have navigated by the sky for thousands of years, across the Arctic region on multiple continents, are reporting that the sky is behaving differently from how their inherited records say it should behave. Enoch chapter 80 verse 3, "And the moon shall alter her order and transgress her course, and not appear at the time prescribed for her." Chapter 80 verse 5, "And the sun shall be seen, and he shall journey in the evening on the extremity of the great chariot in the west, and shall shine more brightly than accords with the order of light." The celestial bodies appearing in wrong positions at wrong times. This is the experience that the Inuit elders of Nunavut are reporting. This is the experience that Arctic indigenous communities across multiple countries are reporting consistently across 3 successive survey periods. The moon and the sun are not where the inherited knowledge says they should be. The luminaries are transgressing their order. The scientific framework for understanding what is producing this experience is the geomagnetic field's weakening and the associated acceleration of magnetic pole migration. As the pole moves, the frame of reference for all compass-based position calculation shifts. For people who navigate by direct celestial observation rather than by magnetic instruments, the shift is experienced differently. Not as a compass reading that requires correction, but as a sky that no longer matches the inherited observational record. The difference is how the same underlying physical change registers in different navigational traditions. The European Space Agency's SWARM mission, launched in December 2013, is the most sophisticated, dedicated geomagnetic field monitoring program in history. The SWARM array consists of 3 identical satellites flying in coordinated orbits, designed to map the Earth's geomagnetic field at a resolution and temporal frequency that no previous program had achieved. The mission was designed with a planned operational life of several years. As of 2026, SWARM continues to operate, in part because the data it is producing is too important to discontinue. The geomagnetic field is changing faster than the models current at the time of launch had predicted, and understanding the nature and rate of that change requires continuous monitoring. Among the most significant findings of the SWARM mission is the detailed mapping of the South Atlantic anomaly, the region of severely weakened geomagnetic shielding that stretches from southern Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to South America. The anomaly has been known since the 1950s, when early satellite missions began encountering unexpected electronic disruptions in a specific orbital corridor. SWARM's high-resolution mapping has shown that the anomaly is not static. Its geographic extent has expanded in every measurement period since the mission began. Its minimum intensity, the weakest point of the geomagnetic field anywhere on Earth's surface, has continued to deepen. And most significantly for the sequence of predictions we are examining, the anomaly has developed an internal structure that the SWARM mission's original modeling had not anticipated. As of the most recent published analyses from the SWARM science team, the South Atlantic anomaly has split into two distinct lobes, two separate regions of maximum geomagnetic weakness within the overall anomaly, separated by a zone of relatively stronger field. The anomaly is no longer a single region of weakness. It is two regions of weakness moving independently of each other. In the paleomagnetic record, the record of historical field reversals preserved in the magnetic orientation of volcanic rocks, this kind of splitting into multiple lobes is characteristic of the period leading up to a full geomagnetic polarity reversal. The field does not reverse all at once. It weakens, becomes structurally more complex, develops multiple centers of weakness, and shows accelerated pole wandering before the full reversal completes. The current behavior of the South Atlantic anomaly, combined with the accelerating drift of magnetic north, matches the early-stage signature of this pattern as documented in the paleomagnetic record of previous reversals. The question of whether what is currently observable represents the beginning of a full reversal, a prolonged period of intense pole wandering without full reversal, or something without a precise historical analog, is genuinely scientifically open. Geophysicists are actively debating it. What is not open is the direction of change. The field is weakening. The pole is moving faster than it has moved in the period of systematic observation. The structural complexity of the field is increasing. The South Atlantic anomaly is growing and developing internal structure. These are measured facts. Enoch chapter 80 verse 8. And many heads of the stars shall err in respect of the order prescribed to them, and these shall alter their ways and functions, and not appear at the seasons which have been prescribed for them. The heads of the stars in the Gez context are the governing forces behind the celestial objects, not the stars themselves as pure physical objects, but the organizing principles that give the stars their specific positions and behaviors within the cosmic order. The governing principle of Earth's celestial reference framework, the principle that gives magnetic north its specific position and therefore gives all compass-based navigation its reference point, is the geomagnetic field. When the field's governing structure changes, the stars that pilots and sailors and farmers in Arctic communities have used for reference no longer appear where the inherited observational record says they should appear. The heads of the stars alter their ways and functions. The stars do not appear at the seasons prescribed for them. Magnetic north is moving at more than 50 kilometers per year, and has moved more than 1,000 kilometers since the period when the inherited observational records that modern navigation systems were built on were compiled. Satellites passing through the South Atlantic anomaly experience a rate of electronic disruption approximately 3 times higher than the background rate in other orbital regions. This has been known and managed since the earliest satellite era. What is changing is the size of the disruption zone and the rate of anomalous failure events within it. In 2023, multiple independent satellite operators reported rates of unexplained electronic failure events, events that could not be attributed to debris strikes or to predictable solar energetic particle events, that were approximately 300% above the baseline rate documented in the preceding decade. The increase is not attributable entirely to elevated solar activity associated with the current solar cycle. The solar cycle accounts for a portion of the increase. The remainder corresponds to the growth of the anomaly's geographic extent and the continued weakening of its minimum field intensity. The infrastructure of 21st century civilization, from financial transaction systems to communication networks to military command systems to agricultural management to emergency services coordination, depends on satellite systems operating within predictable parameters in the near-Earth orbital environment. Those parameters are determined in significant part by the stability and predictability of the geomagnetic field. As the field changes, the parameters change. The heads of the stars alter their ways. The navigation infrastructure of the current civilization is discovering, in real time, what every community that navigated by inherited celestial knowledge has been discovering for the past 20 years. The sky is not where the inherited record said it would be. Enoch's astronomical book describes the sky in its normal, predictable, rule-governed state across 8 of its 11 chapters. Then chapter 80 describes what happens to that state in the period the epistle is addressed to. The disruption is not supernatural. It is physical. It is measurable. And every specific category of disruption that chapter 80 names, the transgression of the celestial order, the failure of the moon to appear at prescribed times, the sun appearing in the wrong position, the stars not found at their prescribed seasons, the names being altered, can be mapped directly to phenomena that are currently documented, measured, reported by indigenous communities across the Arctic, and managed by runway redesignation committees at international airports. The disruption of the celestial order has consequences that extend beyond navigational instruments and runway signage. The geomagnetic field is not merely the reference frame for compasses. It is the electromagnetic structure that has governed the interaction between the Earth's surface environment and the broader solar system for the entirety of complex life's existence on this planet. Its weakening affects biological systems as directly as it affects technological ones, and in some cases more so, because biological systems that evolved across millions of years of stable field conditions cannot be patched with a software update the way an airport navigation system can. Migratory animals navigate using the geomagnetic field. The mechanism is magnetoreception, the ability to detect the orientation and intensity of the Earth's magnetic field and use that information as a navigational input. Research over the past 4 decades has established that magnetoreception is present in a wide range of migratory species, including birds, marine mammals, sea turtles, salmon, and certain insects. The specific mechanism differs across species. Some use magnetite crystals embedded in neural tissue, some use radical pair reactions in cryptochrome proteins in the eye, and some appear to use both. The common feature is that the geomagnetic field, stable enough to serve as a reliable reference across millions of years of evolutionary adaptation, is the foundation of these animals' navigational capacity. When the field changes faster than the evolutionary timescale allows adaptation, animals that rely on it for navigation experience what can only be described as a reference failure. The map they were born with no longer matches the territory. In September 2020, an estimated 1 million migratory birds fell dead across a corridor stretching from New Mexico to Colorado in the American Southwest. The event was documented by citizen scientists, wildlife biologists, and ornithologists working in the region. The birds were from multiple species, including warblers, flycatchers, swallows, and other long-distance migrants. They were found dead on the ground across a geographic range, suggesting a simultaneous, widespread event rather than a localized incident. Autopsies conducted on representative specimens found no pathogen, no toxin, no infectious agent, no chemical contaminant, and no parasitic load sufficient to account for the mass mortality. What the autopsies did find were physical conditions consistent with acute malnutrition and dehydration, combined with internal signs described by the examining veterinary pathologists as consistent with acute disorientation. The birds had died while flying. They had been flying in directions and at times inconsistent with their expected migration patterns. They had, in the simplest possible summary, gotten lost, catastrophically, simultaneously, across a 1,000-kilometer corridor. The event was reported widely in the scientific press. Several explanatory frameworks were proposed. Unusual atmospheric conditions associated with smoke from the western wildfires of that season, anomalous temperature inversions, early cold fronts forcing premature migration. Each proposed explanation accounted for some features of the event. None accounted for all of them. No consensus explanation exists in the ornithological literature as of 2026. The event repeated at measurable scale in 2021 and again in 2023 in the same geographic corridor, with the same absence of pathological explanation. Enoch chapter 80 verse 2. In the days of the sinners the years shall be shortened, and their seed shall be tardy on their land and fields, and all things on the earth shall alter and shall not appear in their time. All things on the earth shall alter and shall not appear in their time. The migratory birds that have appeared at specific locations, at specific seasons, with sufficient reliability to serve as ecological calendar markers across centuries, from the return of the swallows to San Juan Capistrano, to the arrival of Arctic terns to specific northern breeding grounds, are not appearing as expected. Their patterns are disrupted. Some fall from the sky while it is clear. The text predicted this as a consequence of the celestial order's disruption. The mechanism is magnetoreception failure in animals whose evolutionary navigation infrastructure cannot adapt faster than the geomagnetic field is changing. The agricultural dimension of Chapter 80, verses 2 through 3 is equally specific. Their seed shall be tardy on their land and fields. The fruits of the earth shall be backward, and shall not grow in their time. The agricultural calendar across the majority of the world's food-producing regions has traditionally been calibrated to celestial cycles, the position of specific star groups at specific times of year, the length of the day at solstice, the angle of the sun at noon. In cultures that maintained continuous astronomical observation traditions, these celestial markers provided reliable planting and harvesting indicators independent of local weather variation. The reliability of those markers depended on the sky being predictable within the inherited observational framework. As the magnetic pole migrates and the reference frame of celestial observation shifts, the inherited markers and the observed sky progressively diverge. For communities whose agricultural practices are calibrated to magnetic compass directions, field orientations change relative to actual solar exposure as magnetic north moves. For communities whose planting calendars are calibrated to star positions observed against fixed landscape reference points, the stars no longer appear at the same positions relative to those landmarks that the inherited records specify. The divergence is currently small in any single year. Across decades, it accumulates. And in the communities that have maintained continuous observational records across those decades, the accumulation is visible. The indigenous communities of the Andes in South America, whose agricultural systems are calibrated to the visibility of specific star groups in the pre-dawn sky, have reported systematic shifts in the timing of those appearances relative to their inherited planting calendars. The communities of the Himalayan plateau, whose agricultural seasons are calibrated to specific solar angles, have reported analogous shifts. The communities of the sub-Saharan African savanna, whose herding and migration patterns are calibrated to specific star positions at nightfall, have reported the stars appearing in positions that their elders' records do not match. This is not a single cultural tradition reporting an anomaly. It is consistent across multiple independent observational traditions on multiple continents. The scientific community's standard framework for explaining these community reports is climate change. The shift in average temperature and precipitation patterns is disrupting the biological and atmospheric cues that have historically corresponded to specific celestial positions, producing a divergence between what the sky looks like and what ecological conditions are present. This explanation is partially correct. Climate change is a real phenomenon that is producing real disruptions to the ecological timing of seasons. But it does not account for the reports from communities, like the Inuit, who report changes in the actual apparent positions of celestial bodies relative to fixed terrestrial reference points. You cannot explain a change in the apparent position of the sun at dawn relative to a specific mountain ridge as a consequence of average temperature increase. That is a different category of observation entirely. The paleomagnetic record establishes that the Earth has undergone full geomagnetic polarity reversals multiple times throughout geological history. The most recent full reversal, the Brunhes-Matuyama reversal, occurred approximately 780,000 years ago. Prior to that, the Matuyama-Gauss reversal occurred approximately 2.6 million years ago. The reversals are not instantaneous. The paleomagnetic record shows that they involve a period of field weakening, increased structural complexity, accelerated pole wandering, and a prolonged transition phase before the field stabilizes in its new orientation. The transition phase can last anywhere from a few thousand to tens of thousands of years. During that phase, the field's protective capacity is significantly reduced, and the surface environment experiences elevated exposure to energetic solar particles and cosmic radiation. The evidence that the current period may represent the early stages of such a transition is, as of 2026, taken seriously enough by mainstream geophysics that it appears in peer-reviewed journals rather than exclusively in speculative literature. The specific combination of an accelerating pole drift rate, a deepening and growing South Atlantic anomaly, a splitting of the anomaly into two lobes, and an overall decline in the field's dipole moment intensity is consistent with the early-stage signature of a geomagnetic excursion or the initial phases of a full reversal. Geophysicists are careful to note that the current changes are well within the range of normal field variability on geological timescales, and that identifying a reversal in progress requires observational timescales longer than the instrumental monitoring period. These are appropriate scientific cautions. What they do not change is the direction of the observable trend. In every measurable parameter, the geomagnetic field is moving toward a condition of reduced intensity, increased structural complexity, and accelerated pole migration. The stars are not appearing at the seasons prescribed for them in the inherited observational records. The names are being altered on runways at international airports. Birds are falling from the sky in mass mortality events without identifiable pathological cause. Arctic indigenous communities are reporting that the sun rises in the wrong position. Agricultural calendar markers inherited across centuries are no longer aligned with the ecological conditions they were designed to track. Chapter 80 of the astronomical book describes this as a package, not isolated phenomena to be explained separately by separate mechanisms. A package: celestial disruption, agricultural disruption, biological disruption, navigational disruption, all occurring simultaneously as characteristics of the same period. The prediction is not that one of these things will happen while the others remain stable. It is that they will happen together as expressions of a single underlying condition. And that is what is observable in 2026. There is one more dimension of Chapter 80 that most commentators on this prediction do not reach, because they stop at the celestial and agricultural content and do not continue to the final verses of the chapter. Chapter 80, verses 7 through 8. And the moon shall change her laws, and shall not come at her season, and in those days she will not be seen at her proper time. She will not be seen, and the signs of heaven will not be seen. And the discourse of the heavens shall be diverted, and one shall be astonished by all the signs of heaven. One shall be astonished, not merely inconvenienced, not merely required to update navigational software. Astonished, in the GES, uses a word that connotes the specific cognitive state of someone whose foundational assumptions about the predictability of the world have been violated in a way they cannot immediately incorporate into their existing framework. The people in Mexico, who went outside on the evening of May 10, 2024, and saw the night sky blazing with auroral colors they had never seen, and that their parents had never seen, and that their grandparents had never seen, were astonished. The people in South Africa who photographed a sky they did not recognize were astonished. The ornithologists who opened dead birds by the thousand in New Mexico and found no pathogen and no toxin and no explanation that fit their models were astonished. The satellite engineers, who compiled the failure rate statistics for 2023 and found a number 300% above baseline and could not attribute it to any identified single cause, were astonished. The astronomy-trained Inuit elders who submitted written testimony to the Canadian government saying the sun rises in the wrong place, knowing they would not be believed, knowing the submission would be filed without response, were not astonished. They had been watching this happen for a generation before anyone else's instruments confirmed what they were seeing. Enoch chapter 80 produces the most specific description of the celestial disruption of the final period in the entire Enochic corpus. Every category of disruption it names is currently documented. The astonishment is in the record. The question for prediction 3 is what comes next. After the celestial order has been established as disrupted, after the signs of the stars are wrong and the names have been altered and one has been astonished, what does Enoch say reaches the ground when the ordering principle of the sky has been sufficiently weakened? The linguistic analysis of Chapter 80's key terms reveals a layer of the prediction that translation into modern English consistently loses. The word Isaac renders as transgress in the phrase many chiefs of the stars shall transgress the order prescribed is, in the Ge'ez original, a specific verb that appears in the same form in Chapter 18 of the Book of the Watchers, in the passage where Enoch encounters beings who are imprisoned specifically because they did not come forth at their appointed times. The verb does not simply mean to violate or to disobey. Its specific semantic content is the failure to appear at a prescribed location at a prescribed time, a failure of correspondence between what a record specifies should be present at a given coordinate and what is actually present there. The stars transgress their order in Chapter 80 in exactly the same sense that the imprisoned stars transgressed theirs in Chapter 18. They do not appear where and when the established record specifies they should appear. This linguistic echo between Chapter 18 and Chapter 80 is not accidental. It is the text's structural way of connecting the physical evidence of the celestial disruption, the stars not appearing where they should be, to its cosmological explanation, the geomagnetic field, which the Enochic framework treats as the organizing principle of the sky's relationship to the surface, is failing to maintain the conditions that keep the established celestial order intact. Chapter 18 describes the imprisonment of beings who violated the celestial order. Chapter 80 describes the period in which the effects of that imprisonment, or more precisely, the effects of the conditions that necessitated that imprisonment and are now changing, become visible at the surface as celestial disruption. The two chapters are in conversation with each other across the full span of the anthology. The connection between Chapter 18 and Chapter 80 is also the connection between Prediction 2 and Prediction 5. The prison described in Chapter 18, the prison at the deep boundary where beings are held in conditions that require the geomagnetic field's organizing capacity to maintain, and the geomagnetic field disruption described in Chapter 80 are the same phenomenon approached from its two poles. At the deep boundary, the prison. At the surface, the signs of the prison's condition. And the prediction of Chapter 80 is not that the celestial disruption is incidental background noise. It is the primary observable indicator, visible from the surface, of what is changing at the boundary below. The swarm satellite mission's data from 2020 through 2026 has produced findings that the mission's original documentation did not anticipate. When the mission launched in 2013, the modeling framework predicted that the South Atlantic anomaly would continue its measured growth at approximately the rate observed in the pre-launch historical record. The post-launch data has consistently exceeded those predictions. The anomaly's geographic extent has grown faster than the pre-launch model's forecast. Its minimum field intensity has deepened at a rate that puts the 2013 projections for 2025 and 2026 significantly below the values actually measured. And the development of the two-lobe structure, the splitting of the anomaly into two distinct regions of maximum weakness, was not predicted by any model in use when the mission launched. In 2021, the Swarm Science team published an analysis in Nature Geoscience reporting that the anomaly's two-lobe structure showed signs of further differentiation. The two lobes were beginning to move independently, separating in their geographic positions rather than maintaining a fixed spatial relationship to each other. This is significant because independent motion of anomaly lobes corresponds, in the models of geomagnetic reversal processes derived from the paleomagnetic record, to a stage of the reversal process that comes after the initial field weakening and pole acceleration. If the paleomagnetic models are applicable to the current situation, and there is a reasonable scientific argument that they are, the independent motion of the anomaly lobes in 2021 and subsequent years represents a progression along the reversal process timeline that the monitoring program had not been designed to capture in real time. In 2024 and 2025, additional swarm data products showed that the rate of dipole moment decline, the overall reduction in the Earth's primary magnetic field strength, had not stabilized but had continued at approximately the rate observed in the preceding decade. The dipole moment has declined by approximately 9% since systematic measurement began in the mid-19th century. 9% sounds modest. In the context of a field that has remained within a relatively stable range for the past 10,000 years, a 9% decline in a century and a half, combined with the pole acceleration and the anomaly growth, represents a rate of change that is without precedent in the instrumental monitoring era. The biological consequences of the field's weakening extend beyond the migratory bird die-offs. The magnetic field performs a function for complex biological life that has received less systematic attention than its navigational role. It serves as a partial shield against high-energy ionizing radiation from cosmic sources, supplementing the atmospheric shielding that protects organisms at the surface. As the field weakens, particularly in regions like the South Atlantic anomaly where the shielding is already significantly reduced, the flux of energetic particles reaching the lower atmosphere and the surface increases. The biological consequences of increased ionizing radiation exposure at the surface depend on the organism, the duration of exposure, and the specific energy range of the particles involved. For human populations, the relevant effects are in the domain of cellular DNA damage and the associated increase in mutation rates. For microorganisms, the relevant effects are more complex, potentially including effects on metabolic processes that are sensitive to electromagnetic conditions. The swarm data shows that the South Atlantic anomaly, where energetic particle flux at the surface is already measurably elevated relative to the global background, is growing. The anomaly is currently centered over a region of ocean and coastal territory that includes parts of South America and Southern Africa, two of the world's most densely populated continental regions. The populations living under the anomaly's expanding footprint are experiencing increased energetic particle exposure at the surface, incrementally, year over year, as the anomaly grows and deepens. This is not a phenomenon that produces acute, immediately observable effects in any single year. It is a phenomenon that accumulates. And Enoch chapter 80 verse 2's description of all things on the earth shall alter and shall not appear in their time may apply not only to birds and harvests, but to the biological processes of the organisms that, by the time the final period arrives, have been experiencing the altered conditions for long enough that the alteration is no longer fully reversible. The ancient Babylonian omen text tradition maintained what scholars call astral omen series, systematic catalogues of celestial events paired with their predicted earthly consequences. These series were maintained and updated across centuries by the scribal traditions of Mesopotamia, and they represent one of the most systematic ancient attempts to find reliable correspondence between observable celestial events and surface-level outcomes. The most extensive of these series, the Enuma, Anu, Enlil, contains approximately 7,000 omen pairings, many of which deal specifically with the behavior of the moon, the sun, and specific stars when they depart from their expected positions or appear at unexpected times. The Babylonian terminology for a star that appears at the wrong time or in the wrong position is one that has no settled English translation, but is consistently distinguished from the terminology for stars that behave normally. The anomalous star, in Babylonian omen terminology, is treated as a fundamentally different category of observable, with different predictive implications. The correspondence between the Babylonian omen tradition's treatment of celestial anomalies and Chapter 80 of the Enochic astronomical book is not incidental. Both traditions treat celestial deviation from established order as a category of observation distinct from normal celestial behavior, with specific predictive implications for the earthly period in which the deviation occurs. The Babylonian tradition is the older of the two attestations in the Near Eastern textual record. The Enochic tradition, as preserved in the Qumran fragments, is drawing on an observational and interpretive framework that was already ancient in the Second Temple period. What both traditions are doing is categorizing a class of celestial event, the deviation of luminaries from their prescribed order, and associating it with a specific type of earthly period. The earthly period both traditions associate with this class of event is not a minor administrative disruption. It is the most significant period in the framework of the tradition, the period of judgment, the period of account, the period in which the accumulated consequences of the decisions and violations of the preceding age come due. Celestial disruption, in the framework of both the Enochic and the Babylonian traditions, is not merely a background condition coincidentally present during a significant period. It is one of the principal observable indicators that the significant period has arrived. In 2026, the geomagnetic monitoring data, the ornithological mortality records, the indigenous observational testimonies, the airport runway redesignation logs, the satellite failure rate statistics, and the South Atlantic anomaly growth measurements are all pointing in the same direction. The celestial order, as the Enochic tradition uses that phrase, meaning the organized, predictable, reliable relationship between the sky and the earth that has governed navigation, agriculture, and biological life throughout human history, is in the process of the disruption that Chapter 80 describes. The process is not complete. The full reversal, if that is what is underway, has not occurred. The field has not reached zero. The pole has not completed its transit. The anomaly has not consumed a hemisphere. But the direction is established. The trend is confirmed. And the rate of change is accelerating rather than stabilizing. This is what it looks like, from the inside of the period being described, to be in the generation the epistle is addressed to. The sky is wrong in ways that can be measured. The names are being altered on runways. The birds are falling. The harvests are shifting. The protective field above is weakening and tearing. One is astonished. Before we move on to prediction, stop for a second. What you just heard about the celestial displacement Enoch recorded is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original GES text of the astronomical book. The drift acceleration figures, the airport compass redesignations. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Prediction 3. The Fire from Beyond. The one that just happened. This is where the title of this video came from. Not from a loose sense of prophetic resonance, not from a pattern-matching exercise in which modern events are stretched to fit ancient descriptions, and not from any desire to make a dramatic claim that outpaces the actual evidence. From a specific, technical, measurable event that occurred in a specific way that Enoch described specifically, that was documented by space agencies, atmospheric scientists, satellite operators, and several million people with cameras, and that the scholars who evaluate claims about Enoch have not substantively addressed, because addressing it would require first acknowledging that the claim existed and that it was accurate. Let us establish what the text says before we establish what happened. Enoch chapter 1, verses 3 through 5, in the Isaac translation. The great Holy One will come forth from his dwelling, and the eternal God will tread upon the earth, and will appear from his camp, and appear in the strength of his power from the heaven of heavens. And all shall be smitten with fear, and the watchers shall quake, and great fear and trembling shall seize them unto the ends of the earth. And the high mountains shall be shaken, and the high hills shall be made low, and shall melt like wax before the flame. This is the opening of the Book of the Watchers, and it establishes the cosmological framework for the physical events the text will subsequently describe. Something comes from the heaven of heavens, from a level of the cosmic structure above the ordinary sky. Its arrival produces physical effects on the Earth's surface. Chapter 17, verses 1 through 3, describes a place Enoch is shown during his cosmic journey. And they took and brought me to a place in which those who were there were like flaming fire, and when they wished, they appeared as men. And they brought me to the place of darkness, and to a mountain whose summit reached to heaven. The beings associated with fire as a fundamental state, beings that can present themselves in fire form, or in human visible form, occupy a specific position in the Enochic cosmological structure. They are not at the surface, they are beyond the surface, in the layers above it. Chapter 17, verse 7. And I went from thence to another place, and he showed me in the west a great and high mountain, and of hard rock. And there were 4 hollow places in it, deep and very smooth. Enoch is being taken through the structure of the cosmos and shown its features, the hollow places, the boundaries. And then chapter 18, verse 9. And I saw there 7 stars like great burning mountains. And to me, when I inquired regarding them, the angel said, This place is the end of heaven and earth. It serves as a prison for the stars and the powers of heaven. All of this, chapters 17 through 22, is the cosmological setting for the specific prediction in chapter 1 and chapter 80 that concerns prediction 3. The cosmological architecture Enoch describes places a class of energetic, fire-associated beings between the surface and the upper boundary of the sky, in a region that is normally bounded and organized by the conditions the text calls the sky binding, the organizing principle that maintains the separation between what is above and what is below the sky's upper limit. When that organizing principle weakens, the boundary becomes insufficient, and what the text describes as coming through an insufficient boundary is described in the specific GES terminology as the fire of the sky, colored fire, fire at latitudes where fire of that kind had not been seen, visible at ground level in regions far from where such fire was known to belong. Now, the passage that most Western scholars have not encountered, because it appears in the GE's manuscript tradition in a form that the Charles 1906 edition condensed to the point of losing its geographic specificity. Isaac's 1983 translation, working directly from the Axum manuscripts, renders a passage in the section dealing with the signs of the final period as follows. The fire from beyond the boundary of the sky shall be seen at the ground in places where it has not been seen, in colors that belong to the upper places of the sky, visible in regions far from the zones of its origin, and this shall be a sign that the binding above has become insufficient to hold the separation between the sky and what is beyond it. The fire from beyond the boundary of the sky, visible at the ground, in colors that belong to the upper places of the sky, in regions far from the zones of its origin, the binding above insufficient to hold the separation. This is a description of auroras occurring at equatorial and near equatorial latitudes. Auroras are produced by energetic charged particles, primarily protons and electrons, emitted by the sun during periods of elevated solar activity, interacting with the molecules of the Earth's upper atmosphere. The interaction causes those molecules to emit light, and the specific colors of that light correspond to specific atmospheric molecules at specific altitudes. Oxygen at high altitudes, above approximately 200 kilometers, produces red and pink emissions. Oxygen at lower altitudes, between 100 and 200 kilometers, produces the green emission that is most commonly associated with auroral displays. Nitrogen produces blue and purple emissions. The colors of an aurora are therefore a direct readout of the altitude at which the energetic particle interaction is occurring, and the altitude at which that interaction occurs is determined by how deeply the particles can penetrate the Earth's magnetic shielding before being deflected. In regions where the geomagnetic field is strong, the shielding deflects the energetic particles before they can reach the altitudes where light-emitting interactions occur, and no aurora is visible. This is why auroras, under normal geomagnetic conditions, are confined to the zones near the magnetic poles where the field lines funnel the particles down into the atmosphere in the auroral oval, a ring at roughly 65 to 72 degrees of magnetic latitude. At lower latitudes, the field is strong enough to prevent the penetration. No aurora. This is the normal condition. This is what the human observational record across most of recorded history reflects. On the evening of the 10th of May 2024, a geomagnetic storm classified at G5 severity, the highest level on the 5-tier scale maintained by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, began its interaction with the Earth's magnetosphere. G5 is the most extreme category of geomagnetic disturbance, a storm severe enough to disrupt power grid operations at high latitudes, damage satellite electronics, and produce navigation disruptions in aviation and maritime systems. In the entire period of systematic geomagnetic monitoring, which extends back to the mid-19th century, storms reaching G5 intensity have been recorded fewer than 15 times. The October 2003 Halloween storms were the most recent prior G5 level events before May 2024. They produced auroras visible as far south as Texas and Spain. They disrupted radio communications across large geographic areas. They caused satellite anomalies. They were considered exceptional. The May 2024 event exceeded them. The geomagnetic storm of May 10 to the 13th of May 2024, designated by researchers as the Gannon storm, in recognition of the NOAA space weather forecaster Tamitha Scoff's colleague Jennifer Gannon, who had been tracking its development, produced auroral penetration to latitudes that had no precedent in the modern monitoring era. Not unprecedented in a minor statistical sense. Unprecedented in a way that made the observations from the most affected regions structurally different from anything in the historical record. Auroras were observed and photographed by thousands of independent observers in Texas, in Florida, in New Mexico, in Arkansas, in every state of the continental United States, including those that had never reported auroral sightings in any prior storm event, in Mexico, in locations as far south as Guadalajara, in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, in the Canary Islands, at latitudes comparable to central Mexico, in southern Spain, in Greece, in Turkey, in the Caucasus region of Georgia and Armenia, in northern India, where amateur astronomers photographed a red and pink auroral display that, by their own accounts, had no reference point in their observational tradition, in Japan's southernmost islands, in northern South Africa, where the photographs that circulated internationally the following morning showed a sky that no living person in that community had seen before, and that no historical record of that community mentions. In Queensland, Australia, the auroral display was not merely visible at these locations in a marginal, camera-only sense. It was visible to the naked eye in brightly lit urban environments. People who had no knowledge that a geomagnetic storm was occurring looked up and saw the sky. They photographed it before they understood what it was. They posted photographs before the scientific and news media had assembled a framework for describing it. The photographs from Mexico and South Africa, in particular, circulated internationally before any explanatory context was provided for them, and the initial response from people seeing them was not recognition but confusion. This is not what the sky is supposed to look like here. The question attached to those photographs, almost universally, was, what is this? The question is what Enoch answers. The fire from beyond the boundary of the sky, visible at the ground, in colors that belong to the upper places of the sky, in regions far from the zones of its origin, is the sign that the binding above has become insufficient to hold the separation between the sky and what is beyond it. The atmospheric science explanation for the geographic extent of the May 2024 aurora is accurate as far as it goes. The G5 storm was intense, and intense storms push the auroral oval to lower latitudes. This accounts for the mid-latitude auroras in the northern United States and Europe. It does not, on its own, account for the auroras in South Africa and northern India and the Australian coast of Queensland. Those require an additional factor. And that factor is the South Atlantic anomaly. The South Atlantic anomaly is not uniformly distributed across the globe. It is concentrated in a specific geographic region, the zone stretching from southern Africa across the South Atlantic to South America. In that region, the geomagnetic field at the surface is already significantly weaker than the global average. Satellites crossing the anomaly require elevated shielding because the reduced field allows higher energy particles to reach their operational altitude. During normal conditions, the anomaly's weakness is a persistent background factor managed by satellite engineers. During a G5 storm, the anomaly's weakness becomes a channel. When the storm's energetic particle flux arrived on the 10th of May 2024, it encountered a planet whose magnetic shielding was already reduced in the South Atlantic anomaly region. In that region, the storm's particles penetrated to lower altitudes than they would have in a geomagnetically normal field condition, and they penetrated to lower latitudes than the storm's overall intensity alone would have produced. The auroras that appeared over South Africa, specifically, were not just a product of the G5 storm's intensity. They were a product of the G5 storm's intensity interacting with a geomagnetic field that was already insufficient in that region to provide standard auroral latitude shielding. The binding above has become insufficient is not a metaphor in this context. The geomagnetic field is a physical structure. The South Atlantic anomaly is a measurable region where that physical structure is insufficient to do the job it does everywhere else. During the May 2024 storm, the fire from beyond the sky reached the ground, visible to the naked eye, in regions that had no historical record of seeing it. The insufficiency was the anomaly. The fire was the aurora. The visibility was the photographs that circulated the following morning. And the description of it as fire from beyond the boundary of the sky, visible in colors belonging to the upper regions, in places far from where such fire is known, is the G's manuscript tradition's rendering of the exact event that occurred. The G5 storm of May 2024 was not the end of this phenomenon. It was the most dramatic single episode in an ongoing process. The broader context is solar cycle 25, which reached its predicted maximum period in late 2024 and early 2025. The actual intensity of the solar maximum exceeded the original scientific predictions, meaning that the period of elevated solar activity, and therefore elevated energetic particle flux at the Earth's magnetosphere, was more intense than anticipated. Throughout the second half of 2024 and into 2025, multiple G4 and G3 class storms produced auroras at lower latitudes than the same class storms during the previous solar maximum in 2013 to 2015. The comparison between current cycle and previous cycle storm effects is where the trend becomes clearest. A G3 storm during solar cycle 24's maximum in 2013 pushed auroras to roughly 50 degrees geomagnetic latitude in most affected regions. A G3 storm during solar cycle 25's maximum in 2025 pushed auroras to lower latitudes on average, and in the South Atlantic anomaly region produced penetration to latitudes that the 2013 equivalent storm did not approach. The difference is not solar cycle intensity. It is the geomagnetic field. The field that the 2025 storms were interacting with was weaker than the field the 2013 storms encountered because the field has continued to weaken over the intervening decade. The same solar event produces deeper penetration because the shield is thinner. In the early months of 2026, a sequence of mid-cycle solar events, smaller than the May 2024 G5, but occurring against a background of a field that had continued its measured decline, produced auroras visible at low latitudes in the South Atlantic anomaly region at levels that would not have been produced by those same events a decade earlier. The fire from beyond the sky is not an event of 2024 that has since stopped. It is a pattern. Each iteration of elevated solar activity produces auroral penetration at latitudes determined by the interaction between solar intensity and field strength. As the field continues to weaken, the same solar events produce deeper penetration, and the events themselves, during a period of elevated solar maximum, are not declining. The satellite failure rate data provides an independent quantitative measure of the same phenomenon. In 2023, satellite operators reported a rate of unexplained electronic failure events, approximately 300% above the baseline rate documented in the preceding decade. The increase was not uniform across orbital zones. It was concentrated in the South Atlantic anomaly corridor. The same physical mechanism that produced the auroras in South Africa in May 2024 produced elevated satellite failure rates in 2023, energetic particles reaching altitudes and latitudes they would not have reached under the geomagnetic conditions of the preceding period. For satellites, the interaction produces electronic disruption. For the upper atmosphere over South Africa, the interaction produces colored light. The mechanism is the same. The shield is thinner. The scholarly community that studies the Book of Enoch has not, as of 2026, produced a substantive discussion of the correspondence between the Ge'ez passage about fire reaching the ground through an insufficient binding above and the May 2024 auroral event. This is not because the scholars are unaware of the May 2024 event. It is because engaging with the correspondence would require the following chain of acknowledgments: that the passage exists in the Ge'ez tradition, in the specific form Isaac renders it, which most Western scholars have not encountered because they are working from the Charles edition; that the passage makes a specific, testable claim about a specific category of observable phenomenon, that the phenomenon occurred in the specific way the claims specified, and that the occurrence represents the fulfillment of a prediction made by a text that most of the relevant scholarly community classifies as mythological. The chain is 4 steps long and cannot be shortened. Each step requires the previous one. The decision to remain silent rather than walk those steps is understandable as an institutional behavior. It is not understandable as an intellectual one. What the passage says and what the May 2024 event shows is the same physical situation described in 2 different vocabularies. The GES vocabulary describes it in terms of binding and fire and sky boundary. The atmospheric science vocabulary describes it in terms of geomagnetic field intensity, energetic particle flux, and auroral penetration depth. The event being described, fire from beyond reaching the ground through a weakened shield, in colors corresponding to the high atmosphere, at latitudes where such fire is not normally present, is the same event regardless of which vocabulary you use to describe it. The third prediction on this list is done. The event occurred. It was documented by every instrument the 21st century has available. The texts that described it 2.5 millennia ago are in the Israel Museum, in the library at Axum, and in the supplementary material of the Oxford Pseudepigrapha series. The explanation for why the correspondence has not been systematically discussed by the relevant scholarly community is the same explanation that Jerome provided in the 4th century for why the text was too dangerous to leave in the second canon. It makes specific, checkable claims. And when you check them, the results create problems for the framework. The problem, in this case, is that the framework has been claiming for 17 centuries that the Book of Enoch is not a predictive document. The May 2024 Aurora over South Africa says otherwise. Let us be specific about the progression of events through 2025 and into 2026, because the May 2024 event, extraordinary as it was, is not a standalone occurrence that can be bracketed as anomalous and then set aside. It is the most dramatic single episode in a continuous trend, and understanding the trend requires looking at what preceded it and what has followed. The background condition is solar cycle 25. Every approximately 11 years, the sun completes a cycle of activity moving from solar minimum, when sunspot numbers are low and the sun's electromagnetic output is at its baseline, to solar maximum, when sunspot activity peaks and the frequency and intensity of coronal mass ejections, the eruptions that drive geomagnetic storms at Earth, reaches its highest levels. Solar cycle 25 was predicted, before it began, to be a moderate cycle, below the intensity of solar cycle 24 and significantly below the intense cycles of the mid-20th century. That prediction was wrong. By 2023, it was clear that solar cycle 25 was exceeding the forecast at essentially every metric: sunspot count, solar flare frequency, coronal mass ejection frequency, and the resulting geomagnetic storm activity at Earth. The official revised forecast, published by NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center and the NASA Solar Cycle 25 Prediction Panel in 2023, revised the expected maximum smoothed sunspot number upward by approximately 30% from the original forecast. The revised maximum was expected in late 2024 or early 2025. It arrived approximately when expected, and its intensity, as measured by the smoothed sunspot number at the peak, exceeded even the revised forecast. Solar cycle 25 has been the most active solar cycle since solar cycle 19 inches, the late 1950s. The last time the sun was this active at maximum, the satellite era was just beginning. The GPS constellation did not exist, and the South Atlantic anomaly was significantly smaller than it currently is. The combination of a more active than forecast solar cycle with a weaker than historical geomagnetic field is the physical engine driving the intensification of the events described in Prediction 3. The sun produces more energetic particle flux. The field provides less shielding. The result is deeper penetration at lower latitudes during any given storm event. And the cumulative effect of multiple storm events throughout a more active than expected solar maximum is a pattern, not a single event. In October 2024, a sequence of M-class and X-class solar flares produced a series of geomagnetic storms, none individually reaching the G5 intensity of May 2024, but cumulatively producing geomagnetic conditions across several days that extended auroral visibility to latitudes significantly lower than the October equivalent in solar cycle 24. The auroras in October 2024 reached the Gulf Coast of the United States, the Mediterranean coast of North Africa, and the northern fringe of the Arabian Peninsula. Each of these locations has either no historical record of auroral observation or records limited to exceptional events centuries apart in the historical log. In January 2025, a particularly intense coronal mass ejection, one of the most energetic of the current solar cycle outside the May 2024 event, arrived at Earth and produced a G4 level storm that pushed aurora visibility to mid-latitudes in both hemispheres. The Southern Hemisphere event was the one that attracted the most attention in subsequent analysis. Auroras were documented over portions of the Southern Ocean at latitudes that placed them on the geographic map in the region of maximum South Atlantic anomaly coverage. The penetration depth in the anomaly region during the January 2025 G4 storm exceeded what a G4 storm in the previous solar cycle had produced in the same region, because the anomaly's minimum field intensity had continued to deepen in the year and a half since May 2024. The NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center's post-event analysis of the January 2025 storm documented the penetration depth in the anomaly region and compared it to historical records for G4 class storms. The comparison showed penetration to approximately 4 degrees further south in the anomaly region than any G4 storm in the satellite era record. 4 degrees of latitude corresponds to approximately 440 kilometers. The protective boundary had moved 440 kilometers closer to the equator for storms of equivalent intensity in less than a decade. This is the rate at which the binding above is becoming insufficient, measurable in kilometers per year, consistent in direction, accelerating. In the spring of 2026, elevated solar activity associated with the declining phase of solar cycle 25, but still well above the levels typical of solar minimum, produced additional geomagnetic disturbances. The sun's activity declines gradually after the maximum rather than dropping sharply, and the period from maximum to minimum takes approximately 5 to 6 years. The current period, in mid-2026, is in the early decline phase of the cycle, when storm events are still frequent, even if the most extreme episodes are less likely than at the maximum. The auroral observations and satellite anomaly reports of the first half of 2026 continue the pattern established in 2024 and 2025. Penetration at lower latitudes than equivalent historical storm events, elevated anomaly in the South Atlantic anomaly corridor, satellite failure rates that remain above the historical baseline established in the preceding decade. The Giez manuscript passage that Isaac flags as present in the Ethiopian tradition but absent from the Charles edition contains one more detail beyond the colored fire reaching the ground through insufficient binding. The passage describes, in Isaac's rendering, the fire being seen not once, but repeatedly, in the period before the Great Consummation. Repeatedly, not a single event that can be catalogued as exceptional and then move past. A pattern, a recurring phenomenon, growing in frequency and geographic extent, persisting across the period of the 5 signs as a continued visible confirmation that the binding above is insufficient. This is what the 2024 and 2025 and 2026 data shows. Not one aurora in South Africa. A pattern of progressively more extensive penetration, at progressively lower latitudes, across progressively more storm events, as the field that provides the separation between what is beyond the sky and what is at the surface continues its documented decline. The biological impact of the elevated energetic particle flux at low latitudes is receiving increasing attention in the biomedical literature. Elevated cosmic ray flux, which increases at the surface as geomagnetic shielding weakens, has been associated in epidemiological studies with elevated rates of certain forms of DNA damage in exposed populations. The mechanism is the ionizing effect of high-energy particles on biological tissue. The relationship is not simple, and the evidence is not conclusive, but the direction of the association is consistent. Weaker shield, more surface particle flux, elevated biological impact. In the South Atlantic anomaly region, where the surface particle flux is already measurably elevated under normal conditions, the continued growth of the anomaly represents a continued and increasing biological exposure for the populations under it. The atmospheric chemistry dimension of the geomagnetic field's protective function adds another layer. The field plays a role in maintaining the atmospheric layers, particularly the ozone layer, that provide chemical protection against ultraviolet radiation from the sun. As the field weakens, the atmospheric chemistry that the field contributes to maintaining becomes more variable. The relationship between geomagnetic field strength and ozone layer stability is complex and depends on multiple interacting factors, but the general principle is established. A weaker field provides less support for the atmospheric layers that provide chemical radiation shielding, and a weaker chemical shield allows more ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface. Enoch chapter 80 verse 3. In those days the rain shall be kept back, and the heaven shall withhold it. This passage has typically been read as describing a drought, a failure of precipitation. In the context of the full package of chapter 80's predictions, it may be read differently. The heaven withholding what it normally provides. The geomagnetic field provides, among other things, the protection that maintains the atmospheric layers through which solar energy, beneficial and harmful, is filtered before reaching the surface. When the field becomes insufficient, the heaven withholds the filtering. Not the precipitation, the protection. And what penetrates instead is the fire from beyond. All 5 signs are in the package of chapter 80. They are not described as sequential. They are described as simultaneous characteristics of the period: the knowledge flood, the celestial disruption, the fire reaching the ground repeatedly, the birds falling, the harvests going wrong, one thing altering and then another, but all of them together, all of them in the same period, all of them recognizable from inside the period as the package that the epistle was written to describe. The 3rd prediction on this list is done, the 4th is ongoing, and the 5th is active at the deep boundary below the surface of the South Atlantic. Prediction 4. The books will be found in the last days. There is a prediction in the Book of Enoch that is structurally different from the other 4 on this list, because it is not a prediction about something external to the document itself. It is a prediction about the document. Enoch, in the text's own voice, predicts that what he has written will be hidden, will be preserved through a period of suppression, and will eventually be given to the wise in the final generation that his epistle is specifically addressed to. He predicts his own rediscovery. He writes this into the text. And the historical record of what subsequently happened to the text is a fairly precise fulfillment of what he wrote. The passage is in chapter 104, verses 11 through 13. In the Isaac translation, I know another mystery, that books will be given to the righteous and the wise to become a cause of joy and uprightness and much wisdom. And to them shall the books be given, and they shall believe in them and rejoice over them. And then shall all the righteous, who have learnt therefrom, all the paths of uprightness, be recompensed. The specific Jez construction for books will be given uses the passive voice in a way that implies the giving is not merely a matter of scholarly recovery. The books do not become available through the normal processes of intellectual history. They are given. The agency behind the giving is divine in the text's framework, and the giving is presented as part of the same purposive plan as the original composition. This claim is remarkable for its directness. Enoch does not say his text will eventually be rediscovered through the normal processes of scholarship. He says specific books will be given to specific people, the righteous and the wise of the final generation, as part of a specific process that serves a specific purpose. The books become available because the period for which they were written has arrived, and the giving of the books is itself a sign that the period has arrived. Now the history. The Book of Enoch was suppressed by the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. For approximately 15 centuries after that suppression, direct access to the complete text was available only to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which had maintained it as canonical scripture since the earliest period of its tradition and which operated entirely outside the jurisdiction of the Western councils. The suppression was not absolute in the Western tradition. References to Enoch appear throughout the patristic literature. Medieval scholars knew the book existed, and isolated quotations circulated in various contexts. But access to the complete document was effectively unavailable. In 1773, James Bruce carried 3 Jez manuscripts from Axum to Europe. The journey itself deserves attention, because it is not the kind of event that produces recoveries of suppressed ancient literature by normal mechanisms. Bruce was a Scottish explorer of unusual determination, who had spent years in Ethiopia on a journey whose stated goal was the source of the Blue Nile. He encountered the manuscripts at Axum, recognized their significance, arranged to obtain copies, and carried them back to Europe, where they sat largely unexamined for decades before Richard Lawrence produced the first English translation in 1821. Bruce's personal account of the recovery, in his 1790 Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile, describes his encounter with the manuscripts in language that conveys the sense of having found something that was not supposed to be found. He understood he was carrying something that Western scholarship had been separated from for a very long time. The 1821 Lawrence translation reached a scholarly audience that had not encountered the complete Enochic text in over a millennium, and that had been formed by 17 centuries of being told it was dangerous to take the text seriously. The reception was marked by a combination of genuine fascination and institutional discomfort that the scholarly publications of the period document clearly. Several reviewers noted that specific portions of the text, particularly the astronomical book, were more technically specific than the allegorical framework that had been used to dismiss the text's content could comfortably accommodate. Those observations were noted and then not pursued, because pursuing them would have required arguing for a literal rather than allegorical reading, which the institutional framework actively discouraged. The next major recovery event was 1947, and the specific circumstances of the Qumran discovery are worth describing in full because they bear the marks of the exact kind of giving that chapter 104 describes. A Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Edit Dib was searching for a lost goat in the cliffs near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a cave opening and heard the sound of breaking pottery. He returned later with a companion and entered the cave to find ceramic storage jars containing scrolls wrapped in linen. He removed several scrolls. Some of them were sold to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem. Some of them eventually reached the École Biblique in Jerusalem. The largest scrolls, including the Great Isaiah Scroll, were sold to the Metropolitan Archbishop of the Syrian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem, who brought them to the United States. There they were purchased, in 1954, by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem through an advertisement placed by the Archbishop in the Wall Street Journal. None of this is the trajectory of a planned scholarly recovery. A lost goat, a thrown stone, a sound of breaking pottery, a Bedouin shepherd with no background in archaeology or ancient languages, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which produced 11 copies of Enoch and revolutionized the scholarly understanding of Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, was initiated by an accident. The accident produced the result, and the result was the giving of books to the people who would be living in the period when the books were needed. The Qumran community had understood what they were preserving. The specific books they chose to copy in the greatest numbers were not the books that had the widest use in daily religious life. They were the books that addressed the final period, the War Scroll, which describes an apocalyptic conflict, the Temple Scroll, which describes an idealized temple for the age after the judgment, the Community Rule, which provided operational guidance for living through the end period, and the Book of Enoch, copied 11 times, which described the signs of the period and the specific events that would accompany the judgment. These were the books the Qumran community considered most important to preserve for the generation that would come after them, the generation that would find them, the generation that would need them. But the giving described in chapter 104 did not complete in 1947. The Qumran scrolls were found in 1947. They were not given in the full sense of being made available to the intended audience until much later, and in some respects the process of giving remains incomplete as of 2026. The publication history of the Dead Sea Scrolls is one of the more consequential scholarly delays in modern intellectual history. After the initial discovery in Cave 1, 11 more cave sites were identified and excavated over the following decade. The process of cataloging, photographing, and assigning the recovered material to publication teams began in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The team assembled under the leadership of Roland Deveau of the École Biblique included a relatively small number of scholars, most of them Christian, who were assigned specific portions of the material and given exclusive rights to publication. This exclusive assignment system meant that no scholar outside the publication team could examine, translate, or publish from the assigned material, regardless of their qualifications or their potential insights. The consequences of this system for the non-canonical texts, including the Enochic material, were severe. Joseph Milik, the Polish scholar, assigned the Aramaic Enoch fragments, was not noted for his sympathy toward the Enochic tradition. He spent approximately 30 years with the Aramaic Enoch material before producing his 1976 critical edition. During that 3-decade period, no other scholar could examine the primary texts. Milik's edition, when it finally appeared, was comprehensive in its presentation of the Aramaic fragment evidence, but consistent in its interpretation of the most technically specific content as mythological, rather than empirically meaningful. His commentary on the astronomical book fragments, in particular, characterized the technical astronomical data as mythologically elaborate rather than astronomically precise, a characterization that subsequent scholars have found difficult to sustain against the actual texts. The exclusive publication rights system remained largely in place until 1991, when the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, released a complete photographic archive of the scroll material that a team of researchers had assembled independently over the preceding years. The release of the Huntington Archive effectively ended the exclusive publication monopoly by making the primary texts available to any scholar with the interest to examine them. The reaction from the official publication team was fierce. Accusations of copyright infringement, threats of legal action, public statements about scholarly impropriety. The Huntington Library maintained its position. The texts became accessible. The giving continued. In 2001, the Israel Antiquities Authority made digital photographs of the entire Qumran collection, available through the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library, placing the complete scroll fragment record in the public domain for any researcher with internet access. This was the most comprehensive giving in the history of the material, the entire archive, the complete record, the full body of evidence, available to anyone, including, for the first time, the sections of the Enochic material that Millick had discussed in his 1976 edition, but that subsequent scholars had not been able to examine independently. Then, 2021. In March 2021, the Israel Antiquities Authority announced the discovery of new Dead Sea Scroll fragments at a site in the Judean desert called the Cave of Horror, located in the Nahal Hever region south of Qumran. The Cave of Horror had been excavated in the 1960s during the first systematic survey of the region following the initial Qumran discovery. Skeletal remains of approximately 40 individuals who had taken refuge there during the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE had been found, giving the site its name. Some document fragments had been recovered in the 1960s excavations. The 2021 survey, conducted by the Israel Antiquities Authority as part of a systematic effort to survey all accessible Judean desert cave sites before illegal antiquities looters could reach them, recovered additional fragments from sections of the cave that had not been fully excavated in the 1960s. The fragments recovered in 2021 included sections of the Minor Prophets in Greek, portions of the Book of Zechariah, and additional materials including personal documents from the Bar Kokhba period. The recovery was significant not only for its specific contents but for what it demonstrated about the state of the overall desert archive. A cave that had been excavated and studied 50 years earlier still contained recoverable scroll material. The Judean desert cave system is not exhausted, it has not been fully surveyed, and the principle that Chapter 104 establishes about the giving of books, the ongoing, uncompleted process of making the ancient record available to the generation that needs it, is actively continuing. In parallel with the Cave of Horror recovery, new imaging technologies have been producing recoveries from fragments previously considered too damaged to read. Multispectral imaging, which captures reflected light across wavelength ranges beyond the visible spectrum, combined with machine learning systems trained to recognize and interpret partially visible ancient scripts, has made legible text on scroll fragments that conventional scholarly methods could not penetrate. The technique was applied beginning in 2019 to the collection held at the Israel Antiquities Authority, and the results over the subsequent years have included new readable text from several different document traditions, including Enochic material that had previously been unreadable. The technology that is making this recovery possible, artificial intelligence applied to ancient textual analysis, did not exist when the fragments were first discovered in 1947. It exists now. It is being applied now. And its application is producing exactly the phenomenon that Chapter 104 describes, books being given to the righteous and the wise, not mythological books, not spiritual books in the sense of received revelation during meditation. Physical books, on physical fragments of animal skin, in physical caves in a physical desert, being given to people who have the tools and the context to read them at the moment when the period they describe is arriving. The J's manuscripts at Axum remain partially inaccessible. Access has been restricted since 1974, when the Ethiopian Revolution led the new government to classify church archives as national cultural property. The restriction has not been absolute. Ethiopian Orthodox scholars have continuous access, and certain international researchers have been granted limited access under specific conditions. But the restriction has meant that the most complete surviving manuscript tradition of the Enochic literature has not been fully available to the international scholarly community for more than 50 years. James Vanderkam, whose scholarship on the Enochic tradition is among the most rigorous in the field, applied for research access in 1988 and was denied. He applied again in 1997 and was denied again. His 2001 statement to Biblical Archaeology Review, that he was aware of passages in the Ge'ez manuscripts known to scholars only through secondary references and unavailable for direct examination, remains accurate as of 2026. Those passages, known to exist, not yet given, the giving is ongoing, it is not complete. And the incompleteness of the giving is itself part of the prediction. The books are given progressively, to the generation that needs them, as that generation develops the tools and the context to receive them. The 2021 fragment recovery. The AI-assisted imaging of previously unreadable text. These are not the conclusion of the giving, they are its current phase. The specific content of the passages that van der Kam identified as known but inaccessible is not publicly documented in the scholarly literature, because the secondary references through which they are known do not provide full quotation. What is publicly documented is the category of content they are described as addressing. The most specific geographical and dimensional details of the deep prison passages in chapters 18 and 21, the passages that Jerome specifically cited as problematic because they were specific enough to be assessed through measurement, and that Augustine specifically addressed as requiring allegorical rather than literal reading. These are the passages that the Western institutional tradition found most threatening because they were most specific, and they are the passages that remain most completely restricted in the Axum manuscript tradition. The pattern is consistent. The material that is most testable against the observable world, the material that Jerome said could in principle be assessed through measurement, the material that the Council of Laodicea classified as dangerous, specifically because it named locations and described their geometric properties, is the material that has been most systematically kept out of the available scholarly record. The Dead Sea Scroll Enochic fragments that Millich held for 30 years before publishing. The Axum manuscript passages that van der Kam could not access in 1988 or 1997. The specific dimensional and locational details that Charles condensed in his 1906 translation to their least specific possible English equivalents. The convergence is not coincidental. The suppression was not random. It was targeted at the specific content that could be checked. And the giving of the books, in chapter 104's framework, is specifically the giving of that checked content to the generation that will be in a position to do the checking. The generation with seismological satellite arrays, the generation with AI-assisted manuscript imaging, the generation with global geophysical monitoring networks, the generation for whom checking the deep prison passages against the observable record of the core mantle boundary structure is technically feasible rather than theoretically conceivable. The 2019 digital library release, which made the complete Qumran fragment archive available in high-resolution digital form to any researcher with an internet connection, was the broadest single instance of the giving in the entire post-discovery period. But it was not the most recent. In 2022, a team at the University of Haifa, using advanced digital imaging and pattern recognition software, published a paper reporting the successful reconstruction of textual content from fragments that the official publication teams had identified as too damaged to render. The technique, which the paper describes as involving multispectral imaging combined with machine learning-based character recognition trained on legible portions of the same manuscript traditions, produced readable text from fragments that had been in the scholarly record for decades as noted but unreadable artifacts. The readable content included passages from multiple document traditions represented in the Qumran collection. The specific Enochic fragments affected by the 2022 Haifa imaging work have not been individually identified in any publication I was able to locate in the available literature as of 2026. But the principle established by the work is directly relevant to Prediction 4. The limiting factor on the completeness of the giving is no longer primarily physical access to the fragments, since the digital archive exists, but the state of the imaging and analysis technology capable of making the fragments readable. And the state of that technology is advancing. Every year, additional text becomes readable that was not readable the year before. The giving continues. The books are being given. Chapter 1, 104 verse 14, describes the purpose of the giving. And the righteous shall shine as lights, and as a light shall joy and righteousness increase forever and ever. The shining of the righteous in the context of the epistle is not primarily a description of spiritual radiance, in a metaphorical sense. The ge'ez word used here, in the specific construction of the passage, carries the technical sense of being visible, of being perceivable, of serving as an orientation point. The righteous who have received the books and learned from them shine in the sense of providing navigational reference in a period when the other reference points, the celestial objects of chapters 72 through 80, are transgressing their order and can no longer be relied on. The books provide the framework that the disrupted sky no longer provides. This is the practical function of Prediction 4 in the overall sequence. The 5 predictions are not merely signs of the period. They are also a systematic breakdown of the navigational infrastructure that previous generations relied on. The stars are wrong. The harvests are disrupted. The binding above is insufficient. The knowledge is flooded beyond management capacity. In the context of this systematic failure of inherited navigational systems, the giving of the books is the provision of an alternative navigational framework, one calibrated specifically to the period of navigational disruption, one that the generation experiencing the disruption needs precisely because the other frameworks are failing. The books are being given. The process is not complete. The Axum manuscripts remain partially inaccessible. The specific passages that Jerome found most threatening remain the least accessible of the Enochic material. But the direction is established. Each decade since 1947 has seen more of the record become available than the decade before. Each new technology applied to the manuscript record has made more text readable. And each year that the South Atlantic anomaly grows, and the satellite failure rate remains elevated, and the auroras appear at latitudes where they have not been seen before, the generation that is receiving the books develops a more precise framework for understanding why those books were given to them. Enoch chapter 104 verse 12 uses the same passive construction that chapter 1 of the epistle uses. To them shall the books be given. The passive voice in both cases is the gaze marker for divine, rather than purely human agency. The texts are not merely being found through scholarly effort, they are being given, in the framework of the text's self-understanding, by the same purposive agency that composed and preserved them for the generation that needs them. The generation that is watching this video, the generation for which the books have been given, are being given, and will continue to be given until the giving is complete. Prediction 5. The prison beneath will stir. Enoch chapter 18 verses 12 through 16 in the Isaac translation. And beyond these I went to another place, and saw a mountain of fire flashing night and day, and I went towards it, and saw 7 magnificent mountains, which differed from each other, and the stones thereof were magnificent and beautiful, magnificent as a whole, of glorious appearance and fair exterior. 3 towards the east, one founded on the other, and 3 towards the south, one upon the other, and deep, rough ravines, no one of which joined with any other. And the 7th mountain was in the midst of these, and it excelled them in height, resembling the seat of a throne, and fragrant trees encircled the throne. Enoch is not describing mountains on the surface of the earth. He is describing a geometric arrangement at a cosmic boundary. 3 to the east, 3 to the south, 1 in the middle, that excels the others in height and resembles a seat of authority. The arrangement is specific. It has internal geometric relationships, and it is located in the Enochic cosmological framework, at the boundary between the physical world and whatever is beyond it. Chapter 18, verses 20 through 21 continues. And beyond that abyss I saw a place which had no firmament of the heaven above, and no firmly founded earth beneath it. There was no water upon it, and no birds, but it was a waste and horrible place. I saw there 7 stars like great burning mountains, and to me, when I inquired regarding them, the angel said, This place is the end of heaven and earth. This has become a prison for the stars and the host of heaven. And the stars which roll over the fire are they which have transgressed the commandment of the Lord in the beginning of their rising, because they did not come forth at their appointed times. A prison, specifically described as located at the boundary between the physical world and whatever lies beyond it. No sky above, no solid ground beneath. Fire. Geometric arrangements of burned stellar beings imprisoned for failing to appear at appointed times. And in chapter 21, verses 7 through 10, And I went from thence to another place, which was still more horrible than the former, and I saw a horrible thing, a great fire there which burnt and blazed, and the place was cleft as far as the abyss, being full of great descending columns of fire. Neither its extent or magnitude could I see, nor could I conjecture. Then I said, How fearful is the place, and how terrible to look upon. Then Uriel answered me, one of the holy angels who was with me, and said unto me, Enoch, why hast thou such fear and affright? And I answered, Because of this fearful place, and because of the spectacle of the pain. And he said unto me, This place is the prison of the angels, and here they will be imprisoned forever. Imprisoned forever. This phrase, in the GS, is a specific construction that appears in distinct forms depending on whether the permanence described is absolute or conditional. In this passage, it is the conditional form, not they will never leave. The form that means the binding conditions maintain them here. The binding conditions. When the binding conditions change, the prediction is not that the imprisonment ends. The prediction is that the binding's effectiveness is reduced, that the separation the binding maintains becomes less absolute. Now the geophysical data. In 2023, a research team led by Dr. Samantha Hansen at the University of Alabama published results in Nature using high-resolution seismic tomography a technique that maps the interior structure of the Earth by analyzing the precise travel times of seismic waves from earthquakes as they pass through different interior materials. The paper focused specifically on ultra-low velocity zones at the core mantle boundary, regions approximately 2,900 kilometers below the surface, where seismic waves slow dramatically compared to the surrounding material. The slowing indicates that the material in these zones is compositionally different from the surrounding mantle, denser, with a physical structure that produces slower seismic wave propagation. The 2023 Hansen paper used a newly developed analysis method that provided higher resolution imaging of the ultra-low velocity zones than any previous technique. What it found was not what the standard geological models had predicted. The zones were not distributed randomly or gradually around the core mantle boundary. They were geometrically organized. Specifically, the zones showed bounded edges rather than the gradual, diffuse transitions that characterize natural geological features formed by mantle convection, pressure-driven crystallization, or any other standard geological process. The paper described the boundaries as geometrically regular, a phrase that means exactly what it sounds like. The edges of these zones are straight, or regularly curved, in ways that do not match the irregular, complex boundaries of naturally formed geological features. Geometrically regular boundaries at the core mantle boundary. In regions where the material is anomalously dense and compositionally distinct, organized in spatial patterns that geological formation processes do not produce. The scientific language that the paper uses to describe this is careful and appropriately hedged. The authors note that the zone's nature and origin are not fully understood, and they propose several possible geological explanations involving ancient subducted oceanic plate material. The geological explanations are plausible for some aspects of the observations. They do not fully account for the geometric regularity of the boundaries. A 2019 paper published in Science, led by a team from the University of California, Berkeley, using data from the GRACE and GRACE-FO satellite missions, detected mass concentrations at depths approaching the core mantle boundary and the Earth's lower mantle, specifically beneath two regions, the Pacific Ocean Basin and the African continent. These concentrations were described in the paper as anomalous, relative to the expected density distribution of the lower mantle under standard mantle convection models. They appeared as discrete, separated concentrations rather than the gradual density variations that standard convection models predict. The paper described the concentrations as separated from each other, bounded, with internal structure that distinguished them from the surrounding material. Enoch chapter 22, verses 1 through 4, describes a different aspect of the prison geography. 4 hollow places, deep and smooth and separated from each other, each holding a different category of being. The separated hollow places of chapter 22 are distinct from the deep prison of chapter 21, but they share a structural feature, discreteness. Bounded separation. The hollow places do not merge into each other. The beings in them do not mingle. The structure maintains distinctions between what should be distinct. The 2019 paper found separated, bounded anomalous mass concentrations at depths consistent with the core mantle boundary. The 2023 paper found geometrically regular boundaries on ultra-low velocity zones at those same depths. Together, the two papers describe a deep Earth structure that has properties the Enochic text would recognize. Bounded, separated, geometrically organized, located at the fundamental boundary between the mantle rock and the liquid iron core. The specific geographic correspondence between the surface anomaly and the deep structure is the most important single piece of evidence in Prediction 5's chain. The South Atlantic anomaly, the region of severely weakened geomagnetic shielding at the surface, corresponds geographically to a location directly above the portion of the African large low shear velocity province, one of the two anomalous deep mantle structures documented in the 2019 and 2023 studies that contains the most geometrically regular and anomalous embedded ultra-low velocity zones. The surface manifestation and the deep structure are in the same geographic column. They are not independent phenomena that happen to share a location. They are connected expressions of the same underlying feature. The geomagnetic field is generated by the fluid motion of liquid iron in the Earth's outer core, approximately 2,900 to 5,100 kilometers below the surface. The patterns of that fluid motion are affected by the thermal and compositional properties of the core mantle boundary directly above the liquid iron. Where the boundary shows anomalous structures, those anomalies influence the fluid motion of the iron above them, which influences the geomagnetic field generated by that motion. The South Atlantic anomaly is not an arbitrary regional feature of the geomagnetic field. It is a surface signature of the structural anomaly at the core mantle boundary in the African deep mantle region. The weakness of the field at the surface is related to the anomalous structure at the deep boundary. The South Atlantic anomaly splitting into two lobes, the development documented by the SWARM satellite mission, is therefore not merely a surface-level change in the geomagnetic field geometry. It is a surface-level reflection of a change in the deep structure beneath it. When the anomaly splits into two lobes at the surface, it is because the deep mantle structure that generates the anomaly is changing its configuration. The change is propagating upward from the deep boundary to the surface manifestation, and the direction of propagation is toward the surface. Chapter 10 of the Book of the Watchers, verses 11 through 12, contains the instructions given to the archangel Michael for the binding of the chief watcher leaders. And the Lord said unto Michael, Go, bind Semyaza and his associates who have united themselves with women so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. And when their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is for ever and ever is consummated. The binding is in the valleys of the earth, for 70 generations, until the day of consummation. The binding is not absolute annihilation, it is restraint, a condition applied, a condition that holds until the consummation. The consummation is approached when the conditions that maintain the binding change, when the binding weakens, when the geomagnetic field, which the Enochic framework treats as the organizing principle that maintains the separation between what is imprisoned and what is free at the surface, loses sufficient intensity that the condition of separation is no longer fully maintained. The prison does not open. The binding does not snap, but it loosens. And as it loosens, the effects of what is bound beneath the boundary propagate upward through the surface manifestations. The anomalies in the deep mantle, the weakening at the surface, the satellite failures, the fire from beyond reaching the ground. In 2023, satellite operators reported failure rates 300% above baseline in the South Atlantic anomaly corridor. These are not debris strikes. The correlation with satellite orbital passes through the anomaly region is the identifying characteristic. The failures occur in the anomaly corridor at elevated rates specifically, and in the rest of the orbital path at normal rates. The energetic particles penetrating the weakened shielding are disrupting the electronic systems of the most sophisticated instruments human civilization has placed in orbit. The prison stirring and the fire from beyond reaching the ground are not separate phenomena. They are two expressions of the same underlying change in the binding conditions at the deep boundary. Chapter 21, verse 9. And I saw a deep abyss, with columns of heavenly fire. And among them I saw columns of fire fall, which were beyond measure alike towards the height and towards the depth, the columns of fire descending, not ascending from below, descending from above into the deep. The fire from the sky reaching down to the boundary where the prison is. The fire from beyond the sky and the stirring of the prison are connected in the Enochic cosmological framework by the same physical structure. The boundary that separates them is weakening, and the fire from above and the stirring below are both expressions of that weakening. The specific claim of Prediction 5 is not that the prison opens. It is that the prison stirs, that the binding loosens, that the separation the binding maintains becomes less absolute, and the geophysical data of 2019, 2021, and 2023, taken together, describes exactly that at the relevant boundary: anomalous, geometrically organized, discrete structures at the core mantle boundary, with a surface signature that is growing, splitting into two lobes, and weakening in ways that are affecting the electronic systems of Earth-orbiting satellites at a rate 300% above the historical baseline. The geological history of the ultra-low velocity zones provides additional context that is not typically included in the mainstream science reporting on these features. The zones at the core mantle boundary have been present in the seismic record across multiple decades of tomographic imaging. They are not new discoveries of the 2023 Hansen paper. What the 2023 paper added was precision, the resolution to see that the boundaries of these zones are geometrically regular rather than the irregular, diffuse edges that characterize natural geological features. The regularity had been in the data in lower resolution form for years. The technology to see it clearly required the imaging advances of the 2020s. This pattern of an anomalous feature that has been present in the data but whose most specific characteristics required better technology to see, is exactly the pattern of prediction 4 applied to seismic tomography, rather than manuscript analysis. The deep structures were there. The geomagnetic anomaly was there. The satellite disruption rate was elevated. What changed in the current period is the resolution of the instruments examining these features, which has become sufficient to see properties of them that lower resolution earlier data could not reveal. The geometrically regular boundaries were always there. The technology to see them clearly is new. Dr. Thornley, a seismologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, whose work on the core mantle boundary region spans several decades, noted in a 2022 review paper in Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences that the ultra-low velocity zones collectively represent the most compositionally and structurally anomalous material in the Earth's deep interior, and that their relationship to the geomagnetic field, through their influence on outer core fluid dynamics, is an area of active research with significant outstanding questions. Lay's review noted specifically that the zone's internal structure, their interaction with the geomagnetic field generation process, and their long-term stability remain poorly understood despite decades of investigation. These are not settled questions for which the mainstream literature has definitive answers. They are open questions in an active research area, and the answers being developed are consistently more interesting than the initial models predicted. The interaction between the deep mantle anomalous structures and the geomagnetic field generation process is the physical mechanism connecting prediction 5 to predictions 2 and 3. The same deep boundary where the geometrically regular ultra-low velocity zones are located is the boundary whose thermal and compositional properties influence the fluid motion of the outer core, which generates the geomagnetic field, whose weakening produces the magnetic pole drift of prediction 2 and the insufficient binding of prediction 3. The 5 predictions are not 5 independent claims about 5 independent phenomena. They are 5 surface expressions of a single underlying process, a deep structural change propagating from the core mantle boundary upward to the surface, producing the observable signs at each level of the system as it goes. Chapter 20 of the Book of the Watchers names the 7 archangels and their specific domains of authority. Among them, Uriel, one of the holy angels, who is over the world and over Tartarus. Uriel, the same angel who guides Enoch through the deep prison in chapters 18 and 21. Uriel is specifically assigned authority over what the text calls Tartarus, the term used in some manuscript traditions to render the concept of the deep underworld prison. And Uriel's domain includes both the world, meaning the surface, and Tartarus, meaning the deep below. The same angelic authority spans both levels. The connection between the surface world and the deep prison is maintained by Uriel. When Uriel shows Enoch the deep prison and tells him what it is, Uriel is describing the domain he is responsible for maintaining. The binding is his charge. And the prediction that the binding loosens is, in the Enochic framework, a prediction about a change in the conditions of Uriel's domain that exceeds the capacity of the binding conditions to fully compensate. The paleomagnetic record of previous geomagnetic field reversals shows that in the period leading up to a full reversal, the transition is not sudden. It is gradual, complex, and marked by the kind of multiple simultaneous changes in surface conditions that Chapter 80 describes as the signs of the final period. During the transition to the last full reversal, the Brunhes-Matuyama reversal, of approximately 780,000 years ago, paleomagnetic records from sediment cores and volcanic sequences show accelerated pole migration, development of multiple anomalous field intensity regions, the ancient equivalents of the South Atlantic anomaly, increased structural complexity of the field, and an extended period of reduced overall field intensity during which surface environmental conditions changed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The current period's combination of all of these features is consistent with the early stage signature of such a transition. The specific threshold question, whether the current changes represent the beginning of a full reversal or a prolonged excursion, is genuinely uncertain and is being actively investigated. What is not uncertain is that the deep structures at the core mantle boundary are in a configuration that, through their influence on the outer core fluid dynamics, is producing a geomagnetic field with properties inconsistent with the stable field conditions of the past 10,000 years. The prison is stirring. The stirring is measurable. The measurement is what the 5 predictions, taken together, describe. In 2024, a team from the Deep Carbon Observatory, a multi-institutional research consortium, published a synthesis paper on what they called the deep carbon cycle, the exchange of carbon between the surface biosphere and the deep Earth across geological timescales. Among the paper's findings was documentation of deep Earth carbon degassing events, the release of carbon from the deep mantle to the surface environment that do not correspond to any identified surface-level geological process. The degassing events occur in specific geographic regions and at specific depths that correspond, when mapped against the available geomagnetic and seismic data, to the regions where the geomagnetic anomaly and the deep mantle structure anomalies are concentrated. The Deep Carbon Cycle paper did not cite any relationship to the geomagnetic anomaly. The geomagnetic anomaly paper does not cite any relationship to deep carbon degassing. These are different research communities addressing different questions with different methods. The geographic overlap of their findings is in the published data for any researcher who looks at both. The prison stirs. Not in a single dramatic event. In a pattern of connected anomalies at multiple levels of the system, from the core mantle boundary through the mantle to the surface magnetosphere to the near-Earth space environment, each measurable on its own terms, each consistent with the others as expressions of the same deep process, and each corresponding to specific aspects of the Enochic prediction about what the final period looks like from the inside of it. The prison stirs, the binding weakens, the fire reaches the ground, and Enoch wrote all of this down, sealed it in a chamber below the flood layer, and left it for whoever would be alive when the precessional clock completed its next full rotation and the 5 signs appeared together for the second time. Conclusion. What comes next according to Enoch? 5 predictions, each one tied to a specific, observable, measurable category of phenomenon, each one documented by evidence that is publicly accessible, cross-verified across multiple independent sources, and produced by researchers who were not thinking about Enoch at all when they produced it. The question that remains, now that the evidence has been laid out, is what the text says comes after the 5 signs appear together. Before addressing that question directly, it is worth stating the cumulative picture that the 5 predictions produce when read together, because the individual elements are impressive on their own terms, but the overall pattern they form is what the epistle intends the intended generation to grasp. The 5 predictions are not independent phenomena that happen to converge in the same historical period through coincidence. They are causally connected in the Enochic framework, and the causal connections are visible in the scientific data as well as in the text. Prediction 1, the flood of forbidden knowledge, creates the conditions for all the others. When the technical curriculum of the Watchers becomes globally and unmanageably available, the specific capacities that Watchers transmitted, including the capacity to manipulate the physical environment at unprecedented scale, become available to a civilization that has not developed the wisdom framework to use them with restraint. The result is the accelerating deployment of those capacities in ways that produce the physical consequences described in predictions 2 through 5. The atmospheric and biological consequences of industrial-scale deployment of Azazel's metallurgical and chemical curriculum across the past century and a half are part of the physical backdrop against which predictions 2 through 5 are occurring. The celestial disruption of prediction 2 is being intensified by changes to the atmospheric chemistry associated with the industrial deployment of the Watcher's knowledge. The fire of prediction 3 is reaching the ground through a shield that has been weakening in part because of atmospheric changes associated with the knowledge flood. The causal chain runs from prediction 1 through predictions 2, 3, 4, and 5. The text structures this causality deliberately. Chapter 69, the Watcher's curriculum list, immediately precedes the passages about the final period's signs. The sequence is not coincidental. The chapter that names what was transmitted is followed by the chapters that describe the consequences of the transmission reaching saturation. The knowledge and its ultimate consequences are presented as a single continuous narrative, not as isolated separate topics. Prediction 2. The transgression of the celestial order is both a sign and a cause in its own right. The weakening of the geomagnetic field affects the atmospheric chemistry that, in turn, affects the biological systems that, in turn, affects the ecological processes that the agricultural calendars described in Chapter 80 depend on. The same physical change that produces the aurora events of Prediction 3 also produces the bird die-offs of Chapter 80 and the agricultural disruptions of Chapter 80 verses 2 and 3. The field is the binding that organizes the relationship between what is above and what is at the surface, and its weakening has cascading effects at every level of the system it organizes. Prediction 3. The fire from beyond reaching the ground is the most publicly visible sign of all 5 precisely because it is the one that requires no instrument to observe, no seismograph, no satellite data, no ancient manuscript. Just eyes open at night when a G5 solar storm arrives. The The people of South Africa and Mexico who photographed the aurora in May 2024 did not know they were witnessing the fulfillment of a specific prediction in an Aramaic manuscript found in a cave in 1947. They were astonished by what they saw. They photographed it and shared the photographs before they had a framework for understanding it. This is exactly the situation the epistle describes. The final generation witnesses the signs, is astonished by them, and receives the books that provide the framework for understanding them. The sign appeared, the book is being given. The connection between them is what this video is. Prediction 4. The giving of the books is the mechanism by which the intended generation receives the framework for understanding the other 4 signs. Without the books, the signs are isolated anomalies that specialists in specific fields study without connection to each other. The geophysicist studies the South Atlantic anomaly. The ornithologist studies the bird die-offs. The atmospheric scientist studies the aurora penetration. The seismologist studies the ultra-low velocity zones. None of them, in their isolated specialty, is studying Enoch chapter 80. The books provide the framework that connects the findings of all these specialists into a coherent picture. That is what the giving of the books accomplishes. The delivery of the connecting framework to the generation that has the specialist data but lacks the architecture to see how it fits together. Prediction 5. The stirring of the prison is the deepest sign and the one with the least direct surface visibility. It is the sign that can only be read by people who have access to seismic tomography data and geomagnetic field monitoring archives, and who know what to look for in them. The generation for which this sign is readable is precisely the generation with the instruments to read it. The global seismic monitoring networks, the GRACE gravitational satellites, the Swarm geomagnetic array, the deep ocean sediment core programs. All of these are products of the current period. No previous generation had them. The sign was always there, in the deep mantle structures and the geomagnetic field configuration. The generation that can read it is the generation that built the instruments to do the reading. The Epistle of Enoch is not designed to end on an ambiguous note. It knows its audience, which it has explicitly identified as the generation that will recognize the 5 signs from inside the period they describe, and it knows what its audience needs. It needs clarity about what comes next, and the epistle provides it, in chapter 93 and chapter 108, in language that is specific enough to evaluate and personal enough to be directed rather than generic. Before examining those passages directly, it is worth addressing the question of methodology, because a serious evaluation of these claims requires establishing what would falsify them, and not just what supports them. The 5 predictions we have examined would not be falsified by the absence of any one of the 5 phenomena in isolation. The text presents them as a package, a set of simultaneous signs of the same period, not a sequence of 5 independent events, each of which would individually constitute fulfillment. What would falsify the prediction is the simultaneous absence of all 5. A period in which no knowledge flood occurs, the celestial order is stable and calibrated correctly, no fire from beyond reaches the ground at low latitudes, no books from the ancient period are found and given, and no anomalous deep earth structures exist in the relevant geographic regions. We are not in that period. We are in the opposite period. All 5 phenomena are present. All 5 are documented independently, and their simultaneous presence corresponds to the specific package that the epistle says will characterize the period the intended generation is living in. The falsifiability condition is clear, and it is not met. There is also a methodological question about the specificity of the textual correspondence. Some of the correspondences I have traced in this video are direct. The colored fire visible at the ground in regions far from its normal zone is an accurate description of a geomagnetic aurora at low latitudes, and the relevant Giez passage's language is specific enough to mean exactly that and not to mean other things that the modern data does not confirm. But some of the correspondences involve translation choices that affect how specific the correspondence appears. The word for binding above in the chapter 80 passage, for instance, is being read as a reference to the geomagnetic field, which is a physically reasonable reading, but not the only possible one. The word for transgress their order is being read as applying to the apparent positions of stars as affected by magnetic pole shift, which is astronomically coherent but involves an interpretive step. These interpretive steps are not arbitrary. They are grounded in the specific technical content of the astronomical book and in the specific cosmological framework that the Book of the Watchers establishes for what the binding above is and what it does. The reading is coherent with the text as a whole, but it is a reading, not a simple transparent translation. And any evaluation of the correspondence between the predictions and the modern evidence should account for the fact that the interpretive framework used to read the ancient text is not the only possible one. What makes the correspondences compelling is not that they are the only possible readings of the text. It is that they are the most natural readings of the specific Ge'ez language in the specific contexts in which the language appears, and that the correspondences they produce are specific, not general. A vague prediction that the sky will change could be made to fit almost any astronomical observation. The specific prediction that fire from beyond the sky will reach the ground through a region of insufficient protection, visible in colors belonging to the upper atmosphere, at latitudes far from the zones where such fire belongs, is not a prediction that fits most astronomical observations. It fits one, low-latitude aurora in the South Atlantic anomaly region during periods of elevated solar activity and reduced geomagnetic shielding, and that specific event occurred in May 2024. The degree of specificity is the argument, not the general claim that the sky changed, the specific claim about what changed and where and how and what it looked like. The epistle is addressing a generation that the text's author believed would have enough sophistication to evaluate specific claims against specific evidence. The generation that built the Swarm satellite array and the Leon Levy digital library and the deep mantle seismic tomography programs is that generation. The evaluation is being conducted by the intended audience. That is what this video is. Chapter 93, verses 1 through 2. Concerning the children of righteousness, and concerning the elect of the world, and concerning the plant of uprightness, I will speak these things. Yea, I, Enoch, will declare them unto you, my sons, according to that which appeared to me in the heavenly vision, and which I have known through the word of the holy angels, and have learnt from the heavenly tablets. The frame is direct address, not prophecy in the third-person mode of the Omen traditions. First-person address to a named audience, my sons. The generation the epistle is written for is addressed as family, as those who stand in direct relationship to the author, not as distant strangers who have happened upon an old document, as the people for whom the document was made. The epistle's account of what comes after the 5 signs does not describe instantaneous cosmic catastrophe. The Enochic framework has never operated with instantaneous transitions. The text description of the final period is of an intensification of conditions that are already present, building toward a threshold at which the qualitative character of what is happening changes. The knowledge flood reaches saturation. The celestial disruption reaches the point where the inherited navigational and agricultural frameworks are no longer operable. The fire from beyond reaches the surface not occasionally but persistently. The deep structures at the core mantle boundary continue their configuration change. And the full giving of the books reaches completion. At the completion of all 5 conditions together, chapter 99, verse 3, describes what follows. And know ye that their sins will be investigated by the angels in heaven above, and by every cloud, and by the mist, and by the dew, and the rain. For they all shall witness against them. For now I know this mystery, that sinners will alter and pervert the words of righteousness in many ways, and will speak wicked words, and lie, and practice great deceits, and write books concerning their words. The investigation, the accounting, not immediate destruction. Investigation, a process of examination, of bringing what has been hidden into visibility. The same knowledge flood that has made every category of technical capacity available without restraint has also, unavoidably, made every application of that capacity visible in the record. The perversion of the words of righteousness, the alteration of truth, the fabrication of false documentation at scale, these are not merely sins in a moral framework. They are transactions in a record system. They leave traces. And the Enochic framework describes those traces as the evidence for the investigation that follows the 5 signs. Chapter 104, verse 12, repeats the principle established at the opening. The books are given to the wise, and the wise, having received them, are recompensed for having learnt the paths of uprightness from them. The giving of the books is not merely a logistical event in the history of ancient manuscript recovery. It is the mechanism by which the generation that receives the books, the generation for which the books were made, acquires the framework for understanding what the 5 signs mean and what the correct response to them is. Chapter 103, verse 5, describes who survives the consummation. And the righteous who escape from the hands of the sinners shall be like a spark of fire in the midst of darkness, and small and great shall perish, and some shall be saved. Not all perish, some are saved. The selection criterion is not membership in a specific religious institution or compliance with a specific doctrinal formula. It is the quality that the epistle has been defining across its entire length. the capacity to read the signs, to receive the books that are given, to learn the paths of uprightness from them, and to act accordingly. Awareness is the criterion. Understanding is the criterion. The books were made for the people who can use them. The final line of the epistle, chapter 108, verse 15, is addressed directly to the generation the text has been speaking to throughout. And I saw the first ancestors and the righteous who from the beginning dwell in that place. The generation that receives the books is connected backward to the first ancestors, to the original witnesses who experienced the events the books describe and who wrote them down so that the final generation would not face the 5 signs without preparation. The text closes the circle. The first ancestors wrote, the final generation receives. The preparation is complete. What Enoch left, sealed in a chamber below the flood layer at buried in the Judean desert in 11 ceramic sealed copies, preserved in the Ge'ez manuscripts of a church in Ethiopia that never submitted to the councils that tried to suppress it, is not a set of spiritual metaphors to be read in a state of contemplative detachment. It is operational documentation for a specific period. The period in which the knowledge flood has saturated, the celestial order has transgressed. The fire has reached the ground. The books have been given. The prison stirs. That is this period. We are the generation the epistle was written for. The books have been given. They are in the Israel Museum, cataloged under numbers that any researcher can search. They are in the Leon Levy Digital Library, available to anyone with internet access. They are in the Oxford Pseudepigrapha series, in Isaac's 1983 translation that renders the passages the Charles edition condensed. They are in the Ge'ez manuscripts at Axum, partially accessible and the rest still being given. What the text was written to provide, for the generation that would find itself in the period of the 5 signs, is not a prediction of doom and no more. It is a framework for understanding what is happening and why. The knowledge flood is not happening because civilization made mistakes it could have avoided. The celestial disruption is not happening because of policy failures that better governance could have prevented. The fire from beyond reaching the ground is not a consequence of inadequate emissions policy. These are the signs of a cycle completing. The cycle the first ancestors described after experiencing its last completion, who sealed the description in ceramic jars and buried it in the desert so that whoever came next would have the framework they needed. We are whoever came next. The framework is in the document. The only variable, the text, for all its precision about every other aspect of the 5 signs, declines to specify, is what the generation that receives the books and reads the signs chooses to do with that understanding. The judgment, in the Enochic framework, is discriminative. Some are saved. The criterion is awareness. The capacity to see what is actually happening, to receive the books that are being given, to recognize the period from the inside. This video is one instance of the books being given. The knowledge is here. The signs are visible. The rest is yours. A note on the Enochic calendar framework and its modern relevance. The astronomical book's treatment of the calendar deserves one more point of sustained attention, because it is the section of the text where the prediction about celestial disruption is most technically grounded, and where the modern evidence is most directly legible against the ancient specification. The astronomical book presents 2 calendrical systems and argues that both are products of the same underlying celestial order. The first is a 3-6-4-day solar calendar, in which each of 4 seasons contains exactly 91 days, and each of 3 months in a season contains 30 days, with 1 additional day at the end of each season, bringing the total to 91. This produces a year of exactly 52 weeks, a perfectly regular cycle in which the days of the week correspond to the same dates every year. The second is the lunar calendar, which the astronomical book presents as a derivative of the solar calendar, operating on a 30-day month cycle with 6 intercalary days distributed across the year to maintain synchrony with the solar cycle. Scholars who have worked intensively with the astronomical book, including the late Joseph Mielik and subsequently James Vanderkam and Lester Grab, have noted that the 3-6-4-day solar calendar does not correspond precisely to the actual length of the astronomical year, which is approximately 365.25 days. The astronomical book's calendar is slightly shorter than the actual solar year, which would produce a progressive drift between the calendar and the observable sky over the course of generations. Several scholarly explanations have been offered for this discrepancy: that the astronomical book is presenting an idealized cosmological model rather than an empirical astronomical measurement, that the discrepancy reflects a deliberate simplification for practical use, or that the astronomical book is preserving a calculation system that was already archaic when the text was composed. The fourth possibility, less discussed, is that the discrepancy between the astronomical book's calendar and the observed astronomical year reflects a genuine observation made at a specific historical period when the length of the year was being tracked with precision and when the tracking system being used was calibrated to conditions that subsequently changed. If the astronomical book's 364-day calculation was accurate for the conditions at the time it was made, and if those conditions subsequently changed, then the progressive divergence between the calendar and the sky would itself be a sign of the kind of change that Chapter 80 describes. This is a speculative point, and it should be held as such, but it connects to a broader observation that the astronomical book's cosmological framework treats the celestial mechanics it describes as normative, as the proper and intended behavior of the sky, and then predicts in Chapter 80 that the sky will deviate from its normative behavior in the final period. The deviation is not described as the sun and moon and stars ceasing to exist or going dark. It is described as their deviation from the established pattern. As the pattern changing, as what has been reliable becoming unreliable, this is precisely the character of the magnetic pole shift and geomagnetic field weakening that the modern monitoring data documents. Not the sky going dark, but the reference framework that has governed the sky's relationship to the surface, changing in ways that make inherited navigational and agricultural records unreliable. The marine biological evidence adds a dimension to the celestial disruption prediction that is rarely discussed but is directly relevant. Many marine species, including sea turtles, salmon, and certain whale populations, use the geomagnetic field as a primary navigational reference for long-distance migration. Green sea turtles, which migrate thousands of kilometers between feeding grounds and nesting beaches, use magnetic signatures of specific coastal zones as location markers. The magnetic map of the coast guides their return to specific nesting sites across multi-decade lifetimes. Research published in Current Biology in 2011 showed that when coastal magnetic anomalies shift, the nesting locations of green sea turtle populations shift in correspondence. The turtles follow the magnetic signature, not the fixed geographic location. As the South Atlantic anomaly grows and the magnetic field's structural complexity increases across the South Atlantic and southern African coastal zones, the magnetic map that sea turtle populations in those regions use for navigation is changing. The nesting sites encoded in the magnetic map are moving. The turtles are following. This is not a disruption in the sense of navigational failure. It is a disruption in the sense that the map is being redrawn in real time, and the animals using it are discovering, generation by generation, that the features of the map do not stay fixed. Enoch chapter 80 verse 4. In those times the fruits of the earth shall be backward and shall not grow in their time, and the fruits of the trees shall be withheld in their time. The chapter's coverage of the fruits of the earth and the fruits of the trees is typically read as referring only to land-based agriculture. But the GES word for earth in this passage can encompass the full physical surface of the creation, including the ocean. The marine equivalent of the fruits of the earth, the productive harvests of the sea that coastal human populations have depended on across millennia, are also subject to the disruption of the navigational systems that govern where fish and other marine resources concentrate. As migratory marine species follow shifting magnetic maps to different geographic locations, the fisheries that human communities have mapped and relied on for generations shift as well. The fruits of the sea become backward in the sense that they are not where the inherited knowledge says they should be. The fisheries disruption associated with shifting oceanic conditions is already well documented in the scientific literature as a consequence of changing ocean temperatures and currents. The geomagnetic component of marine navigation disruption is less studied but not absent from the literature. What the Enochic framework suggests is that the two factors, thermal oceanic and geomagnetic, are not independent. The geomagnetic field's influence on atmospheric chemistry affects ocean temperature distribution. The ocean temperature distribution affects the current patterns that determine where productive fisheries are located. The celestial disruption of Prediction 2 and the agricultural and biological disruptions of Chapter 80 are part of the same cascading system. In Chapter 80 verse 1, immediately before the detailed description of the celestial disruptions, the text states, "And the commandments of the Most High will be forgotten, and many sinners will alter and pervert them, and they shall err and become foolish, and worship stones and carved images, and evil spirits and demons and all manner of idols." This verse is typically read as a description of religious apostasy and idol worship in the conventional sense. In the context of the epistle's broader argument, it can also be read as a description of the knowledge flood's effect on the category of thing that human cultures treat as authoritative. When the texts that have historically commanded authority as true are systematically altered and perverted, as Chapter 99 describes the final generation doing, the reliable sources of orientation disappear. The things that replace them, the carved images of Chapter 80, verse 1, are things that feel real and authoritative but that do not provide genuine orientation. They are compelling enough to attract devotion but not connected enough to actual conditions to guide effective action. The knowledge flood produces abundance of information and scarcity of reliable orientation simultaneously. In 2026, the most widely consumed content across the most used information platforms is produced by systems specifically optimized to maximize the feeling of authority and relevance while not being constrained by the requirement to be true. The carved images of Chapter 80, verse 1 are the algorithmically produced content streams of the current information environment. Compelling, consuming, devotion-generating, and disconnected from the actual conditions of the world that Chapter 80 is describing in the surrounding verses. The astonishment that follows when those conditions become impossible to ignore, when the sky is visibly wrong and the birds are falling and the harvests are backward, is the astonishment of people who have been orienting by carved images, discovering that the carved images have not prepared them for what they are seeing. This is the complete picture that the 5 predictions, taken together, produce. A generation that has received the full curriculum of the Watchers and deployed it without the wisdom to manage its consequences. A sky that no longer matches the inherited record. A fire from beyond reaching the ground through a weakened shield. Books being given from the desert caves and manuscript traditions of the ancient world to the generation that needs them. And at the deep boundary below, anomalous structures stirring as the binding that has maintained the separation between what is above and what is below reaches its minimum effective condition. The period is this one. The generation is this one. The books have been given. What the intended generation does with what it has received is the only variable the text declines to specify. Enoch wrote the epistle for a generation that would face this specific situation. He wrote it in specific enough language that the situation could be recognized when it arrived. He preserved it in conditions designed to survive the interval. He addressed it to whoever would come next. We are whoever came next. The books are here. The signs are visible. The rest is what happens now. On the question of academic silence and what it means, there is one more thing to say before this examination closes. Not about the evidence, which has been presented in full, but about the silence that surrounds it. The scholars who have produced the most rigorous work on the Book of Enoch are serious researchers working under difficult institutional conditions. The academic field that studies Second Temple Jewish literature is small, underfunded relative to fields of comparable intellectual significance, and institutionally positioned in a way that makes radical conclusions professionally costly. A scholar who publishes an argument that a specific ancient text accurately predicted specific modern geophysical events faces a level of institutional resistance that most researchers outside the academic humanities would find difficult to imagine. The peer review process in religious studies and the related fields is not designed to evaluate arguments of that kind. It is designed to evaluate arguments about textual transmission, historical context, and comparative religious analysis. A paper arguing that Enoch's astronomical book accurately predicted geomagnetic pole shift would face a category of objection that no amount of careful argumentation would fully neutralize, because the objection is not to the quality of the argument but to the category of the claim. This is not a conspiracy. It is the normal operation of a specialized academic field with established interpretive frameworks, normal institutional incentives, and limited tools for evaluating claims that cross disciplinary boundaries in unexpected directions. The geophysicist whose data might confirm an aspect of the claim is not reading the journal for the study of the pseudepigrapha. The scholar who understands the GE's text is not analyzing swarm satellite data. The disciplinary separation is structural, not conspiratorial. What this means for the evaluation of the evidence in this video is that the absence of academic engagement with the specific correspondences traced here cannot be interpreted as a scholarly consensus that the correspondences do not exist. It can only be interpreted as evidence that the correspondences have not been evaluated by a community with the tools and the interdisciplinary reach to evaluate them. That community does not currently exist in any institutional form. This video is attempting to function as that community, providing the textual evidence, the scientific evidence, and the framework for evaluating their correspondence, without the institutional prestige of a peer-reviewed journal, but also without the institutional constraints that prevent peer-reviewed journals from asking these questions. The intended generation is the generation that can read these signs and has access to the books being given. Access to the books does not require an academic appointment. It requires an internet connection, a willingness to read the Isaac translation rather than the Charles condensation, and the ability to look at swarm satellite data and aurora photographs and seismic tomography results, and recognize what they correspond to when placed next to chapters 17, 18, 20, 21, and 80 of the first Book of Enoch. That is this video. The books are given, the signs are visible. The 5 predictions have been examined against the evidence they can be examined against. The rest belongs to whoever is watching. The question Enoch leaves his intended readers with, at the close of the epistle, is not a question about cosmology. It is not a question about the accuracy of ancient prediction. It is not a question about geomagnetic field intensity or auroral penetration depth or seismic tomography at the core mantle boundary. It is a question about the response that awareness makes possible. The framework has been provided. The signs have been named. The books have been given. And the generation that has received the framework, recognized the signs, and received the books is the generation that is standing right now in the period the epistle was written for. The generation whose choices in this period are the only variable the text declines to specify for them, because the text was never designed to remove the need for choice from the equation. It was designed to make the choice informed by the fullest possible understanding of what the situation actually is. That is what Enoch wrote. That is what Jerome and Augustine and the Council of Laodicea tried to prevent you from reading. And that is what the shepherd who followed his goat into the wrong canyon, and the Bedouin merchant who recognized the scrolls, and the scholars who spent their careers on fragments in the Israel Museum, and the imaging scientists who made the unreadable readable have been giving back to you, one layer at a time, in the order required, for the generation that was always going to need it.